There is an island in the eastern Mediterranean where the mountains meet the sea so abruptly that there is almost no room left for anything else. Rocky ridges rise straight from the shoreline, goat paths wind where roads cannot go, and the wind off the water carries the smell of thyme and salt in equal measure. For most of recorded history, this island sat at the crossroads of civilizations: Minoan, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, absorbing each one in turn and outlasting them all. Its people were hardened by that long history into something quiet and unyielding, the way stone is hardened by centuries of weather. The island was called Crete, and in the spring of 1941, it became the stage for one of the most extraordinary, most costly, and most consequential airborne operations ever attempted in the history of warfare. What happened there, across 11 days in May of that year, does not fit neatly into the usual categories of victory and defeat. The Germans won, that much is true. They seized the island, they held it, and they would hold it until the war's end. But the cost of that seizure shocked the men who ordered it, alarmed the commanders who executed it, and ultimately persuaded Adolf Hitler himself never to attempt anything like it again. A weapon forged at enormous expense, years in the making, the pride of an entire branch of Germany's armed forces, the airborne arm, the Fallschirmjäger, was effectively broken on the rocks of Crete, broken by men who were outnumbered in the air, outgunned on the ground, short on sleep and shorter on supplies, and who had retreated to this island already having lost the campaign that preceded it. This is not a simple story of heroism versus aggression, though there is heroism in it beyond any reasonable expectation. It is not purely a story of brilliant planning versus stubborn defense, though both are present in abundance. It is, at its core, a story about the gap between what a military force believes it can do and what the reality of combat actually permits. It is a story about intelligence, possessing knowledge that should guarantee success, and watching that advantage evaporate in the chaos of battle. It is a story about one decision made in darkness and exhaustion by a single junior officer that changed the entire course of the battle. And it is a story about an island population who fought with hunting rifles and farming tools against the most modern airborne force on Earth, and who made the occupiers pay for every year that followed. If you have settled in for the night, if the lights are low and the day's noise is finally fading, then this is exactly the kind of story you want with you in the dark. Not because it is comfortable, it is not, but because it is true, and because truth told with patience and care has a weight to it that no invented drama can match. The Battle of Crete is one of those episodes of history that the broader narrative of the Second World War tends to pass over quickly, absorbed into the grander sweep of events that followed: Barbarossa in the east, the Desert War intensifying in North Africa, the long road toward 1944, and the landings in France. Crete gets a paragraph, maybe two, and then the story moves on. But the men who fought there, on both sides, never quite moved on. German paratroopers who survived described the drop zones as something beyond their training to prepare them for: the ground coming up fast, the air full of fire, comrades falling before they reached the earth. British and New Zealand soldiers who held their positions that first morning described looking up at a sky that had simply filled with aircraft, more aircraft than many of them had seen in their entire lives, and understanding in that moment that the world had changed. Cretan villagers who picked up the weapons of the fallen and joined a battle that was not technically their own, and who would spend the next 4 years paying for that choice under brutal occupation, described the morning of the 20th of May 1941 as the day their island entered a kind of darkness from which it would take a generation to fully emerge. We are going to follow all of them, the German planners in their conference rooms, assembling an operation that had never been attempted at this scale, betting that speed and audacity could substitute for the things they lacked. The British commanders receiving intelligence so precise and so sensitive that they could barely act on it, navigating the impossible contradiction between knowing and being unable to fully use what they knew. The soldiers on the ground, New Zealanders, Australians, British infantry, Greek regulars, exhausted before the battle even began, yet holding airfields and ridgelines against assault after assault, and the Cretans themselves, whose contribution to this battle has been consistently underestimated, and whose suffering under occupation has been inadequately acknowledged in the Western telling of this war. This documentary will not ask you to stay awake and alert through every detail. It is built for the long hours, for the slow drift between attention and rest, for the kind of listening you do when the story carries you rather than demanding you chase it. The narration will take its time, the history will be handled with care, and if you find yourself somewhere between wakefulness and sleep as the account unfolds, that is entirely as it should be. The battle will still be here when you return to it. History is patient in that way. If this is your first time finding this channel, now is the moment to subscribe. We make these documentaries for exactly this purpose. Long-form, deeply researched, historically grounded accounts of the moments that shaped the world, told in a way that respects both the history and the late hour in which you have chosen to encounter it. The Battle of Crete is one of the finest subjects this format has ever been asked to carry, and we intend to give it the treatment it deserves. So settle in, let the day go. In the spring of 1941, the Axis powers had swept across Greece with a speed that left Allied planners scrambling to understand what had happened before the next disaster arrived. The Greek mainland was gone. The evacuation had been desperate and only partially successful. And now, across a narrow strip of water, sat an island that both sides understood to be of enormous importance. An island with airfields that could project air power across the eastern Mediterranean, a harbour that could support naval operations, and a geographic position that sat between Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East like a key in an open lock. The Germans looked at Crete and saw an opportunity. The British looked at Crete and saw a last line that could not be allowed to fall. Both assessments were correct. Both sides would pay heavily to prove it. This is the untold story of the Battle of Crete, the airborne invasion, 11 days that consumed thousands of lives, shattered one of Germany's most prized military instruments, tested British and Commonwealth endurance to its absolute limit, and left a small Mediterranean island carrying wounds that would take decades to heal. It begins with geography. It always begins with geography. The Mediterranean in the spring of 1941 was a sea in crisis. For months, the war had been pulling at its edges, tugging at its coastlines, rewriting the map of control with each passing week. The fall of France had already stripped Britain of its closest ally on the continent. The collapse of Greece now stripped it of its last meaningful presence on the European mainland. Ships moved through that ancient sea, carrying men who had fought hard and lost, soldiers pulled from the rubble of campaigns that had not gone as anyone in London had hoped. The evacuation from the Greek mainland was still fresh, still raw. Tens of thousands of Commonwealth troops had been lifted from beaches under fire, and now they needed somewhere to go. The island of Crete, long and narrow and rising sharply from the sea, received them. It was the only place left. Crete sits roughly 250 kilometers south of the Greek mainland, a long spine of limestone and scrub, stretching nearly 260 kilometers from west to east. Its northern coastline is where the towns cluster: Heraklion, Rethymno, Canea, threaded together by roads that wind between the sea and the mountains. The interior is severe, a world of steep gorges and rocky passes, where even goats pick their paths carefully. The southern coast faces the open Libyan Sea, and beyond that, North Africa. Strategically, this geography is everything. An island positioned between the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean, sitting astride the shipping lanes that connect the Middle East to southern Europe, is not simply a piece of land. It is a lever. Whoever holds it controls what passes beneath and around it. In the spring of 1941, Britain held it, just barely, and not yet under serious threat, but the calculation of what that possession meant was already shifting in Berlin. For the British, the island was at once a refuge and a responsibility. The men flowing in from Greece were exhausted and under-equipped, their units fragmented by the chaos of withdrawal. They carried with them the particular fatigue that comes not from a single fight, but from weeks of falling back, of watching positions held and then abandoned, of knowing that the operational situation demanded retreat even when individual soldiers had not been beaten. Crete absorbed these men and gave them ground to stand on. It offered the comfort, however thin, of land beneath their boots rather than the open water of the Mediterranean. But Crete was not simply a place to rest. Its 3 airfields, at Malaim, at Rethymno, and at Heraklion, made it something considerably more significant than a sanctuary. Aircraft operating from those fields could range across the central and eastern Mediterranean. They could threaten shipping lanes, monitor Axis movements, and project British air power into a theatre that Britain could not otherwise reach by land. The Axis supply line to North Africa ran through those same waters. Rommel's forces in Libya depended on convoys crossing the Mediterranean from Italian ports, carrying fuel and ammunition and vehicles and men. Those convoys were already under pressure from British forces based in Egypt and Malta. An active British air presence on Crete would tighten that pressure considerably, adding another layer of threat to an Axis logistical chain that was never as robust as Berlin wished. This was the geometry of the situation. The island threatened the Axis where the Axis was most vulnerable, and the Axis knew it. What had begun as a British refuge from the Greek collapse was, within days of the evacuation, being reconsidered in German planning rooms as a problem that could not be left unresolved. Hitler's attention in those months was already pointing east. The invasion of the Soviet Union, an operation of a scale that dwarfed anything yet attempted, was scheduled for the summer of 1941. The Führer's strategic instincts, however erratic, had landed on the same conclusion his generals were reaching. The southern flank needed to be secured before that eastern gamble could be taken. Greece had fallen, which helped. Yugoslavia had been subdued, which helped further. But Crete, with its British garrison and its airfields, remained like a thorn pointed at the soft underbelly of Axis logistics. It was, in the language of strategic planning, an unresolved liability, and in the spring of 1941, German commanders were not in the habit of leaving liabilities unresolved for long. Into this situation stepped a man with a particular kind of vision. General Kurt Student had spent years developing and advocating for a form of warfare that most conventional military thinkers regarded with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Airborne forces, paratroopers dropped from aircraft, soldiers carried in gliders to land behind enemy lines, were not new in concept by 1941. Germany had used them in the campaigns in Norway and the Low Countries the previous year, with results that dazzled observers even as they raised questions about cost and sustainability. Student believed in this form of warfare with something close to religious conviction. He had seen what paratroopers could do when surprise was complete and opposition was unprepared. He believed that Crete offered another opportunity to prove the thesis, to demonstrate that vertical envelopment, attacking from the air rather than across a front, could defeat a defender before the defender could fully organize resistance. The proposal student brought forward was audacious by any measure. He envisioned an assault conducted almost entirely from the air, without the support of a significant naval landing force, and without the kind of artillery and armored weight that conventional operations required. The paratroopers would fall from the sky and seize the airfields. Once even one airfield was secured, transport aircraft could begin landing troops and supplies in quantity. The island would be taken not from the sea, as any naval planner would instinctively propose, but from above, a kind of vertical siege, conducted in hours rather than days. The plan rested on several assumptions, each reasonable in isolation and collectively fragile. It assumed that German air superiority over the island would be complete enough to suppress British anti-aircraft fire. It assumed that the garrison was disorganized and demoralized from its retreat out of Greece. It assumed that speed of action would prevent the defenders from consolidating and that the airfields could be seized before British forces understood the full weight of what was falling upon them. These assumptions were not unreasonable given what German intelligence believed it knew about the British position on Crete. The garrison was known to be composed largely of troops withdrawn from Greece, soldiers who had been fighting a losing campaign and who had arrived on the island without their heavy equipment, their vehicles, and in many cases without enough food or ammunition to sustain a prolonged defense. German aerial reconnaissance confirmed that the island's anti-aircraft capabilities were limited. Reports suggested that British morale, already tested by the Greek campaign, might not be equal to the shock of a sudden, violent airborne assault. What those reports did not capture, what no amount of aerial photography could reveal, was the particular quality of the men on the ground. Commonwealth soldiers, and New Zealanders especially, had a relationship with defensive ground that German planners were about to learn in the hardest possible way. Yet the plan moved forward, acquiring momentum of its own, as plans in wartime often do. Hitler, whose enthusiasm for airborne operations had been building since the stunning success at Fort Eben-Emael in Belgium the previous year, gave his approval. The operation was assigned a name, Mercury, which translates as Mercury, and a timeline that reflected the urgency of the Eastern Campaign waiting in the wings. The forces allocated to the assault were substantial by the standards of airborne warfare: thousands of paratroopers, glider-borne assault troops, and the transport aircraft needed to carry them. The Luftwaffe would provide the air cover and the bombing that would soften the defenses before the first man jumped. It was to be a demonstration, a proof of concept, a moment in which a new form of warfare would be validated on a stage large enough to matter. What neither student nor Hitler fully reckoned with was the particular nature of the ground they had chosen for this demonstration. Crete was not the flat terrain of the Dutch lowlands where paratroopers had landed relatively uncontested among populations stunned by the speed of events. Crete was mountainous, and its people were not stunned. They were watching. The island had its own relationship with invasion and occupation, stretching back through centuries of history that had left its population with a particular attitude toward foreign soldiers arriving uninvited. The Cretans who watched German reconnaissance aircraft cross their skies in the days before the 20th of May 1941 understood, with the clarity that comes from old experience, that something was coming. They began sharpening what they had and preparing to use it. The British garrison, for its part, was not as broken as German intelligence suggested. Exhausted, yes. Under-equipped, surely. Without air cover, and without the heavy weapons that would have made their positions impregnable, absolutely. But the men on Crete had dug in around those three airfields with the focused purpose of soldiers who understood the single most important principle of their situation. The airfields were everything. If the Germans could land and secure an airfield, reinforcements would follow in quantity. If the airfields could be held against the initial assault, the paratroopers, dropped without artillery, without armor, carrying only what they could strap to their bodies, would be stranded in small groups in hostile terrain, fighting against defenders who had prepared every rock and ditch for exactly this moment. That was the balance as the 20th of May approached. An island the size of a large English county, sitting in the middle of a contested sea, had become the stage for a genuine experiment in modern warfare. On one side, an idea that air power and vertical assault could overcome geography and prepared resistance. On the other, a reality that men who know the ground they stand on and who understand what they are defending are not easily moved. The outcome was not written in advance. It would be settled in the air and on the ground, in olive groves and on rocky hillsides, in the hours and days that would determine whether an untested theory of war was as powerful as its architects believed, and whether exhausted soldiers could hold the line against an innovation that the world had not yet learned how to defeat. By the spring of 1941, Germany had grown accustomed to the extraordinary. Poland had fallen in weeks. France, long considered an impenetrable military power, had collapsed in a matter of days. The Balkans had bent to German pressure with almost indecent speed. And yet, even within a military establishment drunk on its own momentum, the plan now being assembled in map rooms and operations centers was something altogether different. It was not simply ambitious, it was, by the standards of any military doctrine that had come before it, genuinely without precedent. The Germans were proposing to seize an entire island, a heavily garrisoned, strategically vital island surrounded by water, using only men dropped from the sky. No amphibious fleet, no naval bombardment to soften the shore, no landing craft pushing through the surf with infantry packed shoulder to shoulder, just aircraft, paratroopers, and the audacious belief that gravity itself could be weaponized. The man at the center of this conception was General Kurt Student, and to understand the plan, you must first understand the man. Student was not a conventional staff officer, shaped by the grinding positional warfare of the previous generation. He was an aviator and a theorist, someone who had looked at the static, territorial thinking that dominated military planning and found it insufficient. He had watched the development of the German airborne arm, the Fallschirmjäger, with the intensity of a craftsman watching a tool he had built himself. These were his men. He had fought for their existence within a skeptical military hierarchy, argued for their funding, trained their commanders, and shaped their doctrine. When the war began and his paratroopers performed well in Norway and the Low Countries, he had taken it as confirmation rather than evidence. To Student, the airborne concept was not an experiment, it was a revelation. Crete was simply where the revelation would be made complete. The formal proposal that became Operation Mercury did not emerge fully formed. It was shaped through argument, revised under pressure, and eventually approved through a chain of decisions that mixed genuine strategic thinking with personal advocacy. Student understood that the fall of the Greek mainland had left Crete as the Allies' last substantial foothold in the eastern Mediterranean, and he understood what that foothold meant. British aircraft operating from Cretan airfields could threaten German supply lines running south toward North Africa. The island sat astride sea routes that the Axis needed to remain open. Holding it under Allied control meant holding a blade pointed at German logistics. Seizing it meant removing that blade permanently and placing a new one, pointing in the opposite direction. The strategic logic was coherent. The question was always whether the method could match the ambition. What made the plan genuinely radical was its central premise, that air superiority, applied with enough concentration and aggression, could substitute for every other form of support that a conventional amphibious assault would require. There would be no battleships standing offshore, no destroyers laying down suppressing fire along the beaches. The German Navy was in no position to contest the British Mediterranean fleet in those waters, and everyone in the planning rooms knew it. Students' answer to this problem was to deny that it mattered. If the Luftwaffe could control the sky over Crete completely, if no British aircraft could fly, no gun crew could operate without being strafed, no movement could occur in daylight without being bombed, then the sky itself became the firepower. The paratroopers would not need naval guns to prepare their landing grounds. The aircraft would do it. This was the logic of the plan, and it was not entirely wrong. It simply rested on assumptions that would not survive their first contact with determined men. The initial operation called for assault landings in 2 main waves on a single day. Paratroopers and soldiers carried in by glider would descend on the western part of the island first, targeting the airfield at Malime and the town of Charnia. A second wave, launched in the afternoon, would strike further east at Rethymno and Heraklion. The sequencing mattered. If the first wave secured Malime quickly enough, transport aircraft could begin landing on the airfield with reinforcements before the defenders could recover. Speed was the engine of the entire operation. Speed was what would prevent the garrison from consolidating. Speed was what would deny the defenders time to move reserves, redistribute ammunition, or coordinate counterattacks. Without speed, the paratroopers, scattered across unfamiliar ground, dependent on resupply that could only come by air, would be desperately vulnerable. Every planner in the room understood this, even if not all of them said it clearly. The glider component deserves particular attention because it represented another layer of innovation stacked on top of an already unprecedented concept. Gliders carrying heavy weapons, command elements, and specialists would arrive silently and land directly on or near their objectives, giving the assault its initial punch without the dispersion that parachuting inevitably caused. The men who stepped out of those gliders would be concentrated, armed with crew-served weapons and positioned to hold ground while the paratroopers assembled around them. In theory, the combination of glider assault and parachute drop would give the Germans both precision and mass. In practice, gliders were profoundly difficult to guide, especially across mountainous terrain covered in olive groves and rocky outcroppings that bore no resemblance to the smooth landing fields of training exercises. The theory and the terrain would not always agree. Logistics formed the operation's most obvious vulnerability, and the planners were not blind to it. Once the assault began, the paratroopers on the ground would be consuming ammunition faster than they could be resupplied. Food, water, medical equipment, and additional weapons would all need to come by air, either dropped in canisters or landed on captured airstrips. This created a dependency that had no margin for delay. If Malime did not fall on the first day, or even the first 2 days, German units would begin running short of everything at precisely the moment when they needed to be pressing forward. The plan assumed that British resistance would be sporadic, disorganized, and quickly overwhelmed. It assumed that exhausted troops evacuated from the Greek mainland would be incapable of sustained, coordinated defense. It assumed, in short, that the garrison would behave like a defeated force, because in the planners' minds, that is what it was. Student was not without critics inside his own headquarters. Some senior Luftwaffe officers questioned whether the force available was large enough to guarantee a swift outcome. Others worried about the dispersal that parachute drops inevitably produced, soldiers landing across a wide area, separated from their weapons containers, struggling to assemble under fire, vulnerable in those first minutes, in a way that no amount of training could entirely address. The mountain ranges that divided Crete into isolated pockets concerned officers who had studied the terrain maps carefully. Communications between separated units would be difficult. The possibility that some drops would land badly, in the water, on the wrong side of a ridge, into positions more heavily defended than intelligence had suggested, was real and acknowledged. Student heard these concerns and incorporated them into revised planning only partially. His conviction that the operation would succeed in its essential outlines was strong enough to absorb objections without being fundamentally altered by them. Hitler's own approval of the plan carried conditions and anxieties of its own. The Führer was not an instinctive enthusiast for airborne operations in the same way Student was, and his approval required convincing. What persuaded him was the combination of strategic necessity and the timeline. With the invasion of the Soviet Union scheduled for late June of 1941, there was an exceptionally narrow window in which Crete could be addressed. If it was not taken quickly, the forces committed to the operation would be unavailable for the Eastern Campaign. This meant that the pressure for speed was not merely tactical but strategic in the largest sense. Merker had to succeed fast or not at all, and Hitler's approval came with the implicit understanding that Student's certainty about a rapid result had better be correct. The weight of that understanding would settle very uncomfortably on German shoulders in the days to come. Preparation on the Greek mainland moved quickly once the decision was made. Transport aircraft were gathered from across the German air arm, pulled from other commitments, and concentrated at airfields in Greece and the Aegean Islands. Fuel, canisters of supplies, weapons, ammunition, all were stockpiled under conditions that were themselves complicated. The airfields available were not ideal, runways were inadequate, and the logistics of staging a large airborne force at the end of a long supply line across difficult terrain strained the organization that was supposed to make everything possible. Dust from the unpaved Greek airfields would prove a particular menace, coating engines and instruments, and contributing to mechanical problems that reduced the number of aircraft available on the day. These were known difficulties, managed imperfectly, accepted as the cost of operating at the edge of what was possible. What the German planners could not adequately account for, what their intelligence apparatus had failed to reveal in sufficient detail, was the character of the men waiting for them on the island. The garrison on Crete was exhausted, surely. It was poorly supplied, surely. Its air cover was essentially non-existent, and its anti-aircraft defences were thin relative to the assault that was coming. But the soldiers of the New Zealand and Australian divisions, the British infantry battalions, and the Cretan civilians who would fight alongside them had a quality that no map could measure and no intelligence report had captured. They had already survived one campaign that should have destroyed them. They had seen the worst the Germans could deliver, and had kept their shape as fighting units. Student's plan was built on an assumption about their condition and their willingness to resist. It was, as precise as the plan was in other respects, wrong about this, in ways that would make every other precision largely irrelevant. The aircraft were fueled, the paratroopers were ready, and on the 20th of May 1941, the sky over Crete was about to become the most violent arena of the entire Mediterranean War. The man who stepped forward to hold Crete was not a careful administrator or a staff officer shaped by committee rooms. Bernard Freiberg was something older and stranger than that, a soldier formed in a different war, carrying wounds that would have ended most careers before they began. He had swum ashore at Gallipoli under fire, earned a Victoria Cross on the Western Front, and survived wounds so numerous across 2 decades of soldiering that colleagues sometimes spoke of him in the same breath as myth. He was broad-shouldered and calm in the manner of men who have long since made their peace with danger, and when Churchill pressed him to take command of the island's defences in the final days of April 1941, Freyberg accepted. He did not flinch at the task. He had seen worse odds, or believed he had. What awaited him on Crete would test that belief in ways even he had not anticipated. What Freyberg inherited was not an army in the conventional sense. It was a collection of formations that had been beaten off the Greek mainland in a humiliating withdrawal. Men who had fought rearguard actions through mountain passes and then been lifted off beaches by the Royal Navy while German aircraft hunted them from the sky. They arrived on Crete carrying whatever they could hold in their hands. Heavy weapons had been abandoned in Greece. Artillery pieces had been destroyed to prevent capture. Much of the transport, the signals equipment, the organized supply chain that any functioning military force requires, gone. What remained was roughly 30,000 men from Britain, Australia, New Zealand and Greece, along with Cretan garrison troops, spread across an island nearly 260 kilometers long and rarely more than 50 kilometers wide at any point. They were survivors, and survivors carry a particular kind of damage that does not show on any formal strength return. Freyberg's command was anchored on 3 airfields that would define everything about how the battle would be fought. Maleme in the northwest, Rethymno in the center, and Heraklion farther east. These strips of packed earth and cleared ground were not merely military infrastructure. They were the island's lifelines, its connection to resupply, reinforcement, and ultimately evacuation. Whoever held the airfields held Crete. This was not a complicated equation, and Freyberg understood it from the first briefing he received. He began organizing his forces around the defense of those 3 points, positioning his strongest units where he judged the threat to be greatest. But organizing forces on paper and holding ground with exhausted, under-equipped men are entirely different propositions, and the gap between the two would haunt every decision he made. The absence of air cover was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a structural wound that no amount of tactical ingenuity could heal. The Royal Air Force had committed what aircraft it could to the Greek campaign and had lost the majority of them. By the time Crete became the last remaining Allied position in the eastern Mediterranean, the number of serviceable aircraft available to defend the island was negligible. A handful of Hurricanes and older types, worn beyond reliable service, flown by men who had already been fighting for weeks without pause. When those aircraft attempted to operate over the island, they did so at ruinous cost and with limited effect. German air superiority was not contested, it was absolute. The Luftwaffe could strike at will during daylight hours against any position the defenders occupied. Moving troops in daylight became dangerous. Resupply convoys approaching from Alexandria became targets of opportunity. The sky above Crete belonged entirely to the enemy before the first paratrooper ever boarded a transport plane. Anti-aircraft defenses were another critical gap that Freyberg could neither bridge nor disguise. The guns available to him were fewer than the situation required. Many were obsolete, and ammunition reserves were limited in ways that would matter acutely once sustained air attack began. Positions around Maleme, Rethymno, and Heraklion mounted what guns they could, and crews were organized and drilled with appropriate seriousness. But serious preparation cannot manufacture ammunition that does not exist, and it cannot multiply a battery into a regiment. The anti-aircraft envelope that should have made airborne assault costly enough to abandon was thin where it needed to be dense, and in places it was absent altogether. German planners would encounter it and be hurt by it, but they would not be turned back by it. The holes in the coverage were real, and experienced eyes reading aerial reconnaissance would find them. The human cost of the Greek campaign registered most clearly in the smaller things, the things that formal reports rarely capture. Soldiers moved slowly when they should have moved quickly, not from cowardice, but from the accumulated weight of weeks of retreat, poor sleep, and irregular food. Unit cohesion in some formations had frayed to the point where officers commanding on paper were commanding strangers in practice. Men transferred in from shattered units with no shared experience and no established trust. Equipment that survived Greece was often damaged, partially functional, or stripped of spares. Radio sets that should have linked Freiburg's headquarters to his 3 garrison commands worked intermittently at best. When they worked, they were operated by signalers, doing their best with what remained after the mainland evacuation. When they failed, commanders reverted to messengers, motorcycles, and improvisation, none of which would prove adequate once the battle began in earnest. Freiburg made his assessment and drew his conclusions. He reported honestly to Churchill and to his superiors in Cairo that the force available to him was insufficient for the task as it stood. He needed more artillery, more aircraft, more anti-aircraft guns, and time to reorganize formations that were still finding their feet after Greece. Some of what he requested arrived in the weeks before the invasion. Supplies were run in by warships operating under cover of darkness, and units were reorganized and repositioned with methodical care. But the fundamental deficits were too deep to close in the time available. Crete would be defended by the men already there, with the weapons already on hand, and the shortfalls would have to be answered with discipline and ground chosen well rather than firepower sufficient to the threat. The one advantage Freiburg possessed was the nature of the weapon being used against him. Airborne troops, for all the terror of their novelty, carried a structural weakness that a thinking commander could exploit. They arrived light. They could not bring heavy artillery or armored vehicles with them in meaningful numbers. They landed with what a man could carry or what a glider could hold, and once on the ground, they were dependent on resupply and reinforcement that could only come by air or sea. The critical window, the hours between first landing and consolidation, was when they were most exposed. Scattered, disorganized, searching for their officers and their objectives, paratroopers in those first hours were vulnerable to any force that could reach them quickly and press them hard before they gathered themselves. Freiburg built his defensive thinking around that window. Every unit received the same fundamental instruction. When the paratroopers land, close with them immediately. Do not wait. Do not give them time to form up and find their leaders. Hit them where they fall. This was sound doctrine, and in many places it would prove devastatingly effective. The difficulty was in execution. Closing quickly with scattered paratroopers requires mobile, ready troops who know their ground and can respond without waiting for orders from above. On an island where communications were fragile and formations were still recovering from Greece, the command chain was not always fast enough to translate doctrine into action. Individual units and platoons would do extraordinary work. New Zealanders around Maleme, Australians at Rethymno, British and Greek troops at Heraklion, closing with the enemy and fighting with ferocity that shocked German commanders accustomed to the speed of their own operations. But coordination between those isolated actions, the kind of coordination that transforms local success into strategic advantage, would prove harder to achieve. Freyberg also faced a challenge that was entirely his own to carry, one he could not share with his subordinates or explain to his corps commanders. He had been given access to intelligence of extraordinary precision about German intentions, information that told him when the blow was coming and in what form. But the conditions surrounding that intelligence prevented him from acting on it in the most direct way. He could not stand his men in their defensive positions with full forewarning of exactly what was coming and exactly where, without risking that the Germans would deduce the source of his preparation. The intelligence shaped his thinking in ways he could not articulate aloud, and the burden of that knowledge isolated him at the very moment when clear communication with his commanders mattered most. He was a general who knew more than he could say, defending a position he knew was threatened, with forces he knew were insufficient, and he could not fully explain his reasoning to the men who needed to understand it. The weeks before the 20th of May were spent in a kind of grim, purposeful activity, the sort that soldiers recognize as preparation for something serious. Positions were dug and reinforced, fields of fire cleared, wire laid where wire was available, and patrols sent out across the terrain to map and understand the ground each garrison would have to hold. Cretan civilians began appearing at the edges of these preparations, curious, eager, already sensing what was coming. Some offered help and were quietly absorbed into supporting roles. The garrison had begun to root itself into the island, to know its ridges and olive groves and dry riverbeds. Freyberg reviewed his dispositions with the measured calm that was his public manner, and whatever private calculation ran beneath that calm, he kept it contained. His men were as ready as they could be made. The island would answer for itself when the time came. What Freyberg could not know, and what no intelligence could have told him with precision, was which single decision, made by which single exhausted officer, at which unmarked moment of confusion, would define the entire battle. He had built his defense on a principle sound in theory and demanding in practice, that airborne troops were vulnerable in those first hours, and that denying them time to consolidate was the key to survival. Everything else, the shortages, the exhaustion, the absent air cover, he had acknowledged and accepted as the conditions of the fight. He was prepared to hold Crete, or to die in the attempt, and he believed his men shared that intention. Many of them did. But battles are rarely decided by intention alone, and the island that waited beneath the Mediterranean sun was about to test every assumption Freyberg had made about what his garrison could endure. In a converted Victorian mansion set among the gentle hills of Buckinghamshire, a war was being fought without rifles, without trenches, and without any of the noise that ordinary soldiers would recognize as battle. The men and women who worked inside Bletchley Park did not charge across open ground. They sat at wooden desks, bent over intercepted signals, reconstructing the intentions of an enemy thousands of kilometers away from the scratch and hiss of encoded transmissions. Their weapons were mathematics, patience, and a particular kind of genius that thrived under pressure and exhaustion. By the spring of 1941, those weapons had been sharpened to a remarkable degree. The codebreakers had cracked the Enigma cipher used by German military communications, and the intelligence they produced, classified under the name Ultra, was among the most sensitive secrets of the entire war. To protect it, the British government maintained a fiction that every piece of intelligence derived from Ultra had been gathered through conventional means: aerial reconnaissance, agent reports, captured documents. The fiction had to hold, or the Germans would know their communications were compromised and change their methods overnight. The signals flowing through German military channels in early May of 1941 told a detailed story for those who could read them. Across multiple intercepted transmissions, the picture assembled itself with unusual clarity. Paratroop units were being relocated. Transport aircraft were gathering on Greek airfields in numbers that had no innocent explanation. Supply manifests referred to Crete by name. The timing, the scale, the order of assault, each of these details emerged from the decoded traffic with a precision that went far beyond what normal intelligence operations could have provided. Freyberg was given a briefing that told him, in essence, exactly what the Germans intended. He knew which airfields would be targeted first. He knew roughly when the assault would begin. He knew that German planners believed the operation could succeed within a matter of days. What he held in his hands was the kind of foreknowledge that commanders throughout history had only ever dreamed of possessing. Yet that foreknowledge arrived encased in a set of conditions that made it, in certain crucial respects, almost as burdensome as it was valuable. Freyberg could not tell his subordinate commanders where his information had come from. He could not explain to the officers defending Maleme or Rethymno or Heraklion why he was positioning forces in specific ways, why he seemed certain about intentions the Germans had gone to considerable lengths to conceal. The source had to be protected above all other considerations. A single careless word, a single captured officer who might reveal that the British had known exactly what was coming, could destroy Ultra, and Ultra, in the estimation of those who controlled it, was worth more to the Allied cause than any single battle or any single island. The constraint was not imposed out of bureaucratic indifference. It was imposed because losing Ultra would mean losing the war's most decisive edge, at a moment when the British had precious few edges left. This meant that Freyberg had to operate in a peculiar kind of isolation. He could not share the full picture with the men who needed to act on it. He could gesture toward likely attack vectors, emphasize the importance of certain positions, insist on preparations that his commanders might have questioned given the visible state of their resources. But he could not say, "I know," with near certainty, that the Germans will come from the air, at dawn, aiming for Maleme first. He could not say, "They will land in 3 separate waves, and each wave will be separated by enough time for you to inflict serious damage if you hold your nerve." That knowledge remained locked inside him, shaping his decisions in ways that were visible only as intuition or stubbornness to the men around him. Command has always been a lonely occupation. For Freyberg in those weeks, it was something close to a form of solitary confinement. His subordinate commanders were not men who took orders without question. The New Zealand and Australian officers under his command were capable, experienced, and acutely aware of their circumstances. They had fought through the Greek campaign and watched an organized retreat become something far worse. They knew their men were tired, their supplies were short, and their air cover was effectively non-existent. When Freyberg emphasized certain defensive arrangements, they would naturally have wanted to understand the reasoning. They were entitled to that understanding as professionals. Instead, they received directives that seemed, at times, disproportionate to what they themselves could observe. The intelligence gap between what Freyberg knew and what he could say created friction, subtle, perhaps unspoken, but real, at precisely the moment when his command needed to function as a single coherent instrument. There was also the matter of what Ultra could not tell him. Even the most comprehensive signals intelligence has limits. It can reveal intent and planning. It cannot guarantee that plans will be executed precisely as written, or that the situation on the ground will match the situation described in headquarters documents. Freyberg knew the broad shape of what was coming, but the specific texture of the battle, who would hold, who would break, where a single company commander's decision in an exhausted moment might alter everything, remained beyond any codebreaker's reach. Ultra was a map, and maps show the territory as it is planned, not as it is lived. The gap between those two things, as Freyberg would discover, could swallow an entire campaign. There was a further complication, one that historians have weighed carefully in the decades since the battle. Because Freyberg knew about the airborne assault in considerable detail, his defences were oriented primarily around the 3 airfields the Germans intended to seize. This was correct as far as it went, but some analysts have argued that Ultra's specificity may have focused his attention so firmly on the airborne threat that the possibility of a significant seaborne reinforcement received less weight than it might otherwise have done. Freyberg and his planners were aware that German troops could come by sea as well as by air. The balance of preparation, however, reflected what the signals told him, and the signals emphasized the airborne operation above all else. Intelligence, even perfect intelligence, shapes the mind of the commander who receives it, and that shaping carries its own risks. The garrison on Crete was also receiving briefings that were careful, measured, and deliberately incomplete. Junior officers and soldiers were told to expect an airborne assault. They were given detailed instructions about defensive positions, about the importance of protecting the airfields, about the need to maintain fire discipline against low-flying aircraft. What they were not told was that their commanders had read, in effect, the German operational order. The men of the garrison went about their preparations believing they were working from estimates and probabilities, as soldiers usually do. They had no way of knowing that the intelligence picture was, in certain respects, unusually clear. In one sense, this protected them from the complacency that certain knowledge can produce. In another sense, it meant they could not fully understand or anticipate what was being asked of them. Freyberg himself appears, in the record he left behind, to have carried the weight of this knowledge with a particular kind of stoic unease. He was a decorated soldier, physically formidable and professionally confident. He was not a man given to public expressions of doubt, but the position he occupied, knowing what was coming, unable to fully act on that knowledge, unable to fully explain it, required a form of moral and intellectual discipline that went beyond ordinary command. Every decision he made had to be defensible on grounds other than the truth. Every order had to carry a justification that did not point back to Bletchley Park. He was, in essence, required to act like a man who was guessing, while knowing far more than any guesser could know. That is an unusual and demanding kind of performance. The British intelligence establishment's decision to protect Ultra at the cost of full battlefield transparency was not made lightly, and it was not made without understanding what it might cost. The men at the highest levels of British command understood that Ultra's long-term value to the entire Allied war effort outweighed its tactical value in any single engagement. If revealing Ultra at Crete saved the island but lost the cipher advantage for the campaigns in North Africa, at sea in the Atlantic, and eventually in the great offensives still to come, the trade was a ruinous one. Crete was one island among many that would need to be fought over in the years ahead. Ultra, if it survived, would influence all of them. The calculus was cold and the burden fell on Freyberg to carry it without acknowledgement. What Ultra gave Freyberg, in the end, was a chance. One of the best chances any defender has ever had to prepare for an assault that the attacker believed was secret. What it could not give him was the men, the aircraft, the anti-aircraft guns, the supply lines, and the rested, fully equipped force that turning that chance into a victory would have required. Intelligence illuminates possibilities. It does not manufacture resources. Freyberg knew what was coming with a precision that his German counterparts would have considered impossible. He had positioned his forces as intelligently as the constraints allowed. He had done, within the boundaries of secrecy and supply, nearly everything that could be done. The airfields were defended, the men were in position, and on the morning of the 20th of May, 1941, the German aircraft came exactly as the signals had said they would, in exactly the places they had been predicted, and the battle that would test every calculation began. Before the first paratrooper ever left the ground, the sky above Crete announced what was coming. In the grey half-light of the 20th of May 1941, the men posted on Crete's northern coast heard it first, a low, rolling vibration that climbed steadily into something felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. New Zealand soldiers crouched in their slit trenches along the ridgelines above Maleme airfield, squinting westward into the early morning haze. Some had fought across Greece and been evacuated by sea. They knew the sound of German aircraft. What they did not yet know was the scale of what was descending on them. The bombing began just after dawn. Junkers and Heinkels swept in from the north in successive waves, dropping ordnance across the airfields, the roads between them, and the garrison positions along the coast. The ground shook. Dust and rock erupted across positions that men had spent days digging and reinforcing. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire where ammunition existed and where crews had not yet been silenced, but the guns were too few and the sky held too many aircraft. The Commonwealth troops had learned, over months of retreat and evacuation, to live with the Luftwaffe's dominance overhead. They pressed themselves flat against the earth and counted the seconds between impacts, measuring survival in inches of soil above their heads. Maleme was the Germans' primary objective. The airfield sat on a narrow coastal shelf, flanked to the south by a dry riverbed and overlooked to the east by a hill the defenders had named Hill 107. It was not an elegant position. The terrain was broken, the vegetation sparse, and the approaches difficult, but it was the only working airstrip in the western half of the island. Whoever held Maleme held the door. The New Zealand battalion responsible for its defence had prepared their positions with care, sighting machine guns on the high ground and wiring the approaches where wire could be found. They had been told to expect airborne attack. They had not been told how many aircraft could fill the sky over a single airfield. The bombers eventually gave way to fighters, sweeping low along the coast in strafing runs that kept heads down and disrupted any attempt to move reserves into position. For nearly 2 hours, the garrison at Maleme endured the bombardment in relative silence, unable to respond meaningfully, able only to survive. Runners were cut off. Telephone lines were severed. Company commanders lost contact with their battalion headquarters and waited, absorbing punishment, committing their men to nothing until the nature of the assault became clear. This enforced patience was not cowardice. It was the hard discipline of men who had learned that to stand in the open was to die. Then the transport planes appeared. They came in long columns from the northwest, Junkers 52s, lumbering and distinctive, their corrugated fuselages making them look almost industrial, unglamorous, nothing like instruments of a dramatic new kind of warfare. But from each one, at low altitude, figures began to fall. The parachutes opened in quick succession, hundreds of them blossoming across the sky in colours that seemed almost festive against the morning blue. The New Zealanders on Hill 107 had a clear view. For a fraction of a second, the sight was so extraordinary that men simply stared. Then the order to fire ran down the line, and the defensive positions erupted. The Germans fell into a storm. Anti-aircraft guns that had survived the bombing shifted their barrels downward and opened fire on the transport planes themselves, some of which broke apart before completing their drop runs. The paratroopers descending could not maneuver and could not fire effectively during the drop. Their weapons were packed in separate containers that would land somewhere in the field below, and until they reached the ground and located their equipment, they were almost entirely helpless. The New Zealanders knew this. Every man who had been briefed on airborne assault had been told the same thing: kill them on the way down, kill them before they can organize, because once they consolidate, they become something else entirely. The garrison did exactly that. German paratroopers landed in olive groves, in vineyard plots, in the dry riverbed below the airfield, and in the open ground directly in front of prepared positions. Many did not survive the first minutes on Cretan soil. Yet the waves kept coming. This was the part that defied expectation. Not that the Germans had come, but that they continued coming despite the losses visibly accumulating on the ground below. The transport columns had been carefully sequenced, one group following the last, at intervals calculated to maintain pressure and overwhelm the garrison's ability to engage multiple threats at once. A second wave descended over different sections of the perimeter, then elements of a third. Defenders who had been firing steadily since the first drop began to track ammunition consumption with a new urgency, passing counts back through the chain of command in voices that remained controlled but carried weight. The morning was barely half over. Around the western end of the airfield and along the road toward the village of Malime, individual German groups began the desperate process of finding their weapon containers and forming into something resembling tactical units. This was slower and more costly than any of them had trained for. Cretan civilians complicated the picture considerably. Men who had been farmers days before moved through the olive groves with whatever weapons existed: hunting rifles, old service arms, knives, farm tools, and attacked isolated German soldiers who had become separated from their units during the chaos of the landing. The paratroopers had been briefed on resistance from Commonwealth forces. They had not been fully prepared for an entire population that treated the invasion as a personal affront and responded accordingly. The fighting around the Hill 107 position was the most intense of the morning. The New Zealanders holding the high ground had clear sightlines across the approaches, and they used them. German attempts to cross the open ground below the hill in the first hours of the assault were broken repeatedly by fire that was disciplined and carefully sustained. Several groups of paratroopers who made it to cover in the riverbed found themselves pinned, unable to advance toward their objectives and unable to withdraw without crossing open ground under observation. Some waited there for hours as the battle evolved around them. German radio reports back to the Airborne Command spoke of casualties far exceeding expectations, of positions not taken, of timelines already dissolving under the pressure of actual resistance. Farther east along the coast, at Rethymno and Heraklion, separate airborne drops were unfolding with similar difficulty. German paratroopers fell into organized fire from garrisons that had prepared for this exact scenario, and the losses at those locations were, in some respects, even more severe than at Malime in the early hours. But the commanders in those sectors had no way of knowing what was happening 60 or 80 kilometers to their west, and the men at Malime had no detailed knowledge of the other battles. The island had been cut into fragments by the bombing and the disruption of communications, and each garrison was fighting its own isolated version of the same war. The coherent, coordinated defense that might have been possible under unbroken communications now had to be improvised moment by company commanders working from what they could see and hear. By mid-morning, the German operation had cost its commanders more than they had accounted for. The airfield itself had not fallen. Hill 107 remained in New Zealand hands. The paratroopers who had survived the landings were fighting in dispersed groups across difficult terrain, organized into scratch formations, their original operational structure badly disrupted. German planners back on the mainland, receiving fragmentary reports from unit radios, understood that the morning had not gone as designed. Yet Student and his staff held to the operation. The aircraft were already returning to their staging fields in Greece to prepare for the next wave. The plan demanded continuation. The question was whether the momentum of aggression could compensate for the losses already sustained. What neither side fully grasped in those chaotic morning hours was that the battle's outcome would not be determined by the first day's fighting alone. The New Zealand defence had performed notably well against the initial assault, inflicting casualties that no airborne force could sustain indefinitely. But sustaining that defence required coordination, resupply, and the preservation of the key terrain that commanded the airfield. As the morning wore on and the afternoon approached, the exhaustion of the garrison was real, the ammunition situation was worsening, and the communication failures that Freiburg had feared were already beginning to distort the picture for commanders at every level. The morning of invasion had tested British and Commonwealth resolve and found it solid. What the afternoon would test was something more fragile and more consequential. The chain of command that translated courage into action. By the evening of the 20th of May 1941, the men holding the ground around Maleme airfield had been fighting since first light. They had watched the sky split open with transport planes, watched paratroopers spill out into a storm of fire, and had held. The runway itself was pocked and contested. German bodies lay across the scrub and olive groves surrounding the perimeter. Testament, no, evidence of just how costly the morning had been for the invaders. Yet the New Zealanders who anchored that defence had not rested for a single hour, and their ammunition, their water, and their certainty were all bleeding away at the same rate. What the morning had given them in confidence, the afternoon was slowly, methodically taking back. They had stopped the first wave, stopping the second, and the third, and whatever came after that was a different question entirely. The geography of Maleme was not generous to defenders. The airfield sat on a flat coastal strip, flanked on its western edge by the Tavronitis riverbed, and dominated on its southern side by a rise of ground the men had come to call Hill 107. Whoever held that hill looked down onto the runway. Whoever held the runway controlled the western gate to the island. The New Zealand battalion tasked with anchoring this position had understood from the beginning that Hill 107 was not simply tactically important. It was the keystone of the entire Maleme defence. Lose it, and the airfield became indefensible. Lose the airfield, and something far larger than a single battle would begin to tilt. The men on that hill knew this. They had fought through the day with that knowledge pressing on them like a physical weight. Among the German forces, the assault on Maleme had not gone according to any plan student staff had drawn up in Athens. The glider landings near the Tavronitis had been partially successful, and a nucleus of German troops had formed on the western side of the riverbed, sheltering in the dry gravel and the scrub, trying to push east toward the runway. But their numbers were badly thinned, their radios frequently silent, and their dead outnumbered the living in several sections of their assault. The paratroops who had dropped south and east of the airfield had fared worst of all. Scattered by wind and fire, many had died before they could reach their weapons canisters. What had looked on paper in Athens like a coordinated seizure of a vital objective had become, on the ground in Crete, a ragged, desperate improvisation. The Germans at Maleme were not winning, but they had not yet lost. As the afternoon shadows began to stretch across the airfield, the New Zealand company commander on Hill 107 faced a calculation that no training manual had prepared him for. His men were exhausted beyond what that word normally means. They had fought through one of the heaviest airborne assaults ever attempted. They had taken casualties, and their communications with battalion headquarters had become unreliable to the point of uselessness. Reports coming back from his flanks were fragmentary, contradictory, and often simply absent. He did not know with confidence whether the units to his left and right were still in position, still fighting, or had already been forced back. In that vacuum of information, he made a judgment. He concluded that his position on part of the hill had become untenable, that to stay without support was to invite encirclement, and that a withdrawal to consolidate with the remainder of his force was the rational, defensible choice. He was not wrong in his reasoning. The tragedy is that his reasoning was built on incomplete facts. The withdrawal itself was disciplined and deliberate, not a rout. The men pulled back in order, covering each other, moving with the controlled exhaustion of soldiers who had not yet given up, but could no longer hold. It was, in the technical language of ground warfare, a tactical repositioning, a pullback to a line that could be held rather than a line that was already crumbling. In different circumstances, with functioning communications and a clear picture of the wider battle, it might have been recognized immediately as exactly that, a temporary adjustment, and steps could have been taken to reoccupy the lost ground before dawn. But the circumstances were not different. The communications were broken. The picture was anything but clear, and the German observers watching from the Tavronitis riverbed did not see a tactical repositioning. They saw what looked to them like a withdrawal. And a withdrawal, in the logic of an assault, is an invitation. German commanders on the western bank of the Tavronitis had spent the afternoon in their own private crisis, trying to hold their force together and find a way to push across onto the runway. They had sent messages back to students' headquarters that painted a picture of near-catastrophic losses, of positions held by handfuls of men, of an operation that was close to collapse. Student himself had been receiving those reports all afternoon, struggling to decide whether to press forward or concede the airfield and attempt a different axis of attack elsewhere on the island. Then, sometime in the last hours of daylight, the reports shifted. German scouts and observers reported that the high ground on the southern edge of the airfield appeared unoccupied, or at least less strongly held than it had been. The pressure on the runway's western approaches seemed to ease. It was not a large change. It did not look, from the German side, like a dramatic reversal, but in a battle being fought on margins this thin, a small change in the topography of resistance was enough to alter everything. German troops began moving across the Tavronitis riverbed and onto the airfield during the night. They moved carefully, expecting fire, and found less than they had feared. They pushed up toward Hill 107 and found the ground they reached largely empty of the resistance that had bled them all day. By the time the first grey light of the 21st of May began to filter across the Cretan coastline, German soldiers were occupying ground on the hill and along the runway that, the evening before, had been the heart of the New Zealand defence. They were not yet secure. They were not yet reinforced. But they were there, and in warfare, presence is the first and most consequential form of possession. What the Germans had stumbled into, through their own battered persistence and through the compounding effects of a single withdrawal decision, was something that General Students planners had designated as the necessary precondition for everything else. With any portion of Malimi's runway in their hands, they could attempt to land transport aircraft. Not safely, not easily, surely not without cost. The runway was still under British fire from the surrounding area, and aircraft landing there would take hits. But Student made the decision that his commanders on the ground did not have the luxury of waiting for a secure, cleared airfield. They would land on what they had. The planes would come in, unload, and either take off or be written off. The airfield did not need to be safe. It only needed to be usable. The first transport aircraft to attempt the landing did so under fire. Some were hit on approach. Some crashed on the pitted, debris-strewn surface of the runway. Others managed to discharge their troops and turn back, trailing smoke. It was a brutal, costly method of reinforcement, and it bore no resemblance to the orderly, efficient build-up that students' original plan had described. But it worked. Each aircraft that landed and discharged its men added to the number of German soldiers on Cretan soil at Maleme. Each hour that passed allowed those men to dig in a little deeper, push a little further from the runway's edge, and make the airfield a little more difficult to reclaim. The mathematics of the situation were turning, slowly and then with gathering speed, against the defenders. By the morning of the 21st, the New Zealand and British commanders were beginning to understand that something had gone badly wrong at Maleme, though the full picture was still forming. Reports from the airfield area described German troops in positions that should not have been possible if the hill had been held through the night. There was confusion about what had happened, about who had moved and when and why. The gap between what the defenders had believed they were holding and what they actually still controlled was widening by the hour. Counterattack orders were issued, but the communications delays, the distances, and the sheer exhaustion of the troops meant that any response would be slow. And in this battle, slow was a currency that the Commonwealth forces were rapidly running out of. The men who had withdrawn from Hill 107 had not surrendered Crete. That is important to understand. They had made the best decision available to them with the information they had, which was almost no information at all. The failure was not theirs alone, and arguably it was not a failure of courage or intent in any meaningful sense. It was a failure of the systems around them, the communications, the command clarity, the flow of accurate information that allows a military force to respond to a battle as it actually is, rather than as it was several hours ago. Those systems had already been under enormous strain before the first paratrooper hit the ground on the 20th of May. The assault had shattered what remained of them. Into that broken space, through a gap in the defenses that was as much informational as it was physical, the Germans had walked. The loss of Maleme airfield was not a single dramatic event. There was no explosion, no final charge, no visible moment at which one side prevailed and the other fell back. It was something more insidious, a slow, compound failure of information, communication, and circumstance, accumulating across the hours of a single afternoon and night until it resolved, by morning, into a strategic catastrophe. The airfield that the Germans had not been able to seize by force in the daylight hours of the 20th of May had instead been conceded through the fog of the night that followed. And now, as transport aircraft continued to arrive on the battered strip, despite the fire and the wreckage and the cost, the battle's balance shifted in a direction it would not reverse. The hinge had turned. What came next would be fought in the shroud of what had been lost here, on a hill above a runway, in the long and terrible dark. While the storm of combat raged around Maleme airfield in the western reaches of Crete, the eastern half of the island presented a starkly different scene. At Rethymno and Heraklion, separated from the western struggle by miles of rugged terrain and poor roads, the defenders faced the German onslaught with organization and resolve that would extract a fearsome toll from the invaders. These two airfields became crucibles of desperate resistance, where the outcome of battle hinged not on grand strategy or armored maneuvers, but on the courage of soldiers who held ground knowing that reinforcement might never arrive. The men stationed here had watched their comrades in Greece fall back in humiliation merely weeks before. Now, standing amid the dust and noise of invasion, they carried a determination to exact a price for every inch of Cretan soil. What unfolded at Rethymno and Heraklion was a demonstration that prepared defense, even against novel airborne assault, could inflict devastating casualties on an enemy convinced of swift victory. Rethymno airfield lay roughly midway along the northern coast, a modest facility defended by an Australian battalion, supplemented by Greek forces and local Cretan volunteers, hastily armed and organized for combat. As German transport aircraft approached in formation and paratroopers began to descend on the morning of the 20th of May, the defenders were ready. Unlike the chaos that had engulfed Maleme, where communications had fractured and command had faltered, the Australian garrison and their supporting units had established clear defensive positions around the airfield. Anti-aircraft gun crews had their weapons sighted and ready. Infantry riflemen were distributed in depth, occupying strong points that covered the landing zones. The Germans, descending into this prepared reception, suffered grievously from the outset. Machine gun fire tore through the air, catching paratroopers as they drifted helplessly on their parachutes, unable to return fire effectively. Those who reached the ground found themselves scattered and isolated, their weapons containers missing or inaccessible, their commanders separated from their men. The Australian defenders, veterans of North Africa, though battle-worn from the withdrawal from Greece, maintained their discipline and their fire. Wave after wave of German transport aircraft dropped their loads into a furnace of defensive fire. The paratroopers who landed at Rethymno that day faced not the uncertain or wavering resistance they had encountered elsewhere, but a garrison that had prepared specifically to destroy them on the ground. The fighting around Rethymno quickly took on a pattern of desperate German attempts to consolidate and regroup, met by Australian and Greek counterattacks that drove them back into the surrounding hills. German paratroopers who had survived the descent found themselves in small groups, often without officers, without communications, and without the heavy weapons that had been dropped in separate containers that fell beyond their reach. The Australian commander, operating with clear knowledge of his defensive positions and the arrival timing of the German assault, conducted a methodical defense that prevented the Germans from ever establishing a secure perimeter around the airfield. One group of German paratroopers attempted to seize a ridge overlooking the field, believing that height and firepower would allow them to dominate the airfield and facilitate further landings. The Australians, recognizing the threat, launched an immediate counterattack up the slope, meeting the Germans in brutal close-quarter combat. Grenades erupted on the ridgeline. Men lunged forward with fixed bayonets. The Germans were driven back, and many were captured or killed. This pattern repeated throughout the first day and the days that followed, with each German attempt to secure a foothold met by Australian and Greek resistance that transformed scattered paratroopers into isolated pockets of desperate men fighting for survival rather than for territorial gain. At Heraklion, farther east and the island's largest settlement, the airfield itself was defended by a garrison of British soldiers and Cretan forces under British command. The defence here followed a similar template of careful preparation and ferocious execution, though Heraklion's larger size and more complex terrain meant that combat took on an even more scattered and fragmented character. German paratroopers descended around the airfield and into the town itself, where British troops had established defensive positions in buildings and street corners. The density of combat in an urban and semi-urban environment meant that German attempts to mass their scattered forces became nearly impossible. Machine gun crews positioned in buildings commanded street approaches. Riflemen engaged paratroopers at close range, as they struggled to cut through fences or scale walls to reach defensive positions. German paratroopers, who had trained for rapid consolidation and assault, found themselves instead engaged in a slow, attritional process of clearing buildings and streets against determined defenders. The British garrison, though smaller than it needed to be, fought with the discipline of trained soldiers who understood that time was their most precious commodity. Every hour of resistance meant that the scattered German units could not consolidate. Every German company or platoon tied down in combat with British defenders was a unit unavailable to reinforce the critical struggle at Melaim. The men at Heraklion did not know this, could not have known that their desperate resistance was serving a larger purpose in the unfolding battle across the island. They fought because they were soldiers, and because surrender was not an option that men of that generation readily embraced. The Cretan civilians who inhabited the spaces around these airfields became fighters as necessity transformed them from observers into combatants. As German paratroopers scattered across the landscape, many without weapons or communication with their units, Cretan men emerged from villages and farms carrying whatever arms could be found or improvised. Some had rifles left behind by the Greek army or captured in the weeks before. Others carried shotguns, farming implements sharpened into crude spears or knives. The British commanders, recognizing the value of these impromptu fighters, organized them into loose formations and assigned them to support regular troops. Cretan soldiers and villagers scouted the terrain, tracked German movements, and engaged in skirmishing that prevented German paratroopers from moving freely across the landscape. A group of German paratroopers attempting to reach the airfield near Heraklion might find their path cut by Cretan fighters who knew the ground intimately and who understood that the Germans represented occupation and conquest. The courage of these civilian fighters cannot be separated from their understanding that this was their homeland under assault. They fought not because they had been drafted or ordered, but because the invasion threatened their families and their homes. The Germans, descended on the island as conquerors, found themselves opposed not just by organized military units, but by an entire population that viewed them as invaders to be resisted by any means available. German commanders at Rethymno and Heraklion, their original plans shattered by the intensity of the defense, attempted to adapt and overcome through the sheer weight of reinforcements and repeated assault. On the 21st of May, German transport aircraft continued to arrive, attempting to land new paratroopers and glider-borne infantry at the disputed airfields. But the defences at both locations remained intact. The British and Australian soldiers, though exhausted and running low on ammunition, continued to shoot down transport aircraft or force them to land in areas away from the prepared defensive positions. At Heraklion, a group of German paratroopers managed to secure one section of the airfield perimeter late on the first day of fighting. German commanders attempted to exploit this breakthrough, ordering additional transport aircraft to land in the secured area. But the British garrison, understanding the danger, immediately launched a counterattack that pushed the Germans back and restored unified control of the airfield. At Rethymno, the pattern was even more decisive. The Australians and Greeks had maintained control of the airfield throughout the first day and the days that followed. German attempts to seize the field from surrounding hills met repeated failure. By the evening of the 21st of May, both Rethymno and Heraklion remained firmly in British hands, and the German paratroopers who had landed at these locations were isolated and cut off from any realistic prospect of receiving the supplies and reinforcements they desperately needed. The toll of this resistance became visible in the casualty reports that filtered back to German commanders. At both airfields, German paratroopers were being killed and wounded at rates that staggered the commanders who observed them. Men who had trained extensively in aerial insertion and who had been convinced of their own superiority as a new form of warrior found themselves pinned down, unable to move, unable to communicate with their units, dying from rifle fire and machine gun bursts in situations where their special training offered no advantage. The isolation of German units meant that even German officers who were alive and in contact with their men often lacked any knowledge of how the larger battle was developing. They knew only what they could observe in their immediate vicinity: hostile fire from multiple directions, ammunition running low, wounded men with no medical care available, and no apparent reinforcements arriving to support them. German commanders at the regimental and battalion level found themselves commanding fragments rather than cohesive units. Men became lost in the terrain, separated from their units, and forced to join whatever defensive position they could find. Others became casualties, their bodies left where they fell in the dust and scrub brush of the Cretan landscape. The certainty and swagger with which German planners had conceived Operation Mercury seemed increasingly like fantasy when confronted with the reality of desperate men fighting for survival in an unfamiliar land against an enemy that would not yield. The British garrisons at Rethymno and Heraklion, though inflicting mounting casualties on their attackers, could not help but recognize the precariousness of their own position. Communication with Major General Freyberg's headquarters in the western part of the island became increasingly sporadic and difficult. The roads connecting east and west were either cut by German forces or too dangerous to traverse with any reliability. News of events at Maleme, where the airfield had apparently been lost and German reinforcements were allegedly landing in increasing numbers, reached these eastern garrisons in fragmentary and often contradictory form. Some reports suggested that Maleme had fallen and that a German breakthrough was imminent. Other reports were more optimistic, suggesting that Maleme remained contested. The uncertainty was itself a form of burden that pressed on the commanders at Rethymno and Heraklion. They knew they were holding ground, inflicting heavy casualties and preventing the Germans from securing their assigned objectives, but they could not know whether their sacrifice was buying time for a successful defense of the island as a whole, or whether they were being slowly encircled and isolated for eventual capture or destruction. The men in the ranks understood even less, knowing only what they could observe in their immediate surroundings and what rumors whispered through their units about the broader situation. They held their positions because that was what soldiers did, because orders had been given, and because retreat seemed less bearable than standing firm. As the second and third days of the invasion progressed, the German situation at Rethymno and Heraklion deteriorated further, even as German strength at Maleme continued to grow. At both eastern airfields, German forces remained fragmented and unable to achieve the breakthrough that would allow them to consolidate control and enable significant reinforcement. The British and Australian defenders, though exhausted and running low on ammunition and supplies, maintained their discipline and their defensive perimeters. At Heraklion in particular, the British garrison launched repeated counterattacks into German positions, driving back attempted German advances and recapturing territory. The fierce fighting meant that combat at these locations continued to consume German resources and German lives, even as the strategic focus of the battle shifted westward to Maleme. German paratroopers who had expected to land, regroup, and rapidly secure their objectives found themselves instead locked in a grinding battle of attrition against an enemy that would not break. The paratroopers' training and their equipment gave them no decisive advantage in these conditions. They were being bested not by superior numbers, but by superior organization, better positioning, and the resolve of men defending their ground against invaders. The garrisons at Rethymno and Heraklion were denied knowledge of the extent to which their resistance was contributing to the overall German defeat or survival of the battle. Freyberg's intelligence and his own calculations had already begun to suggest that holding the island might be impossible, yet the men at these eastern locations could not know this. They could not know that elsewhere on the island, at Maleme, the situation had deteriorated to a point where the defense was no longer tenable. They fought on in their isolated corners of Crete, inflicting casualties and holding ground, believing that their sacrifice was part of a larger defense. This illusion, though it was only an illusion, gave meaning to their suffering. They were not simply enduring punishment for a lost cause. They were contributing to something larger than themselves. Whether this was true in the strategic sense became increasingly irrelevant to the men in the trenches and buildings of Rethymno and Heraklion. What mattered was that they had been ordered to hold, and that they were holding. The burden of command fell on the local officers and the senior non-commissioned officers who had to maintain morale and discipline while knowing nothing of Freyberg's calculations about the viability of the defense. By the 24th of May, 4 days into the invasion, the situation at Rethymno and Heraklion had become clear to any observer. The British and Australian garrisons had achieved a remarkable defensive success. They had repulsed German assault after assault. They had inflicted casualties at a rate that staggered the German invaders. They had maintained control of their assigned airfields despite the numerical limitations of their garrisons and the novelty and apparent superiority of German airborne tactics. Yet this remarkable success was being rendered strategically irrelevant by what had transpired at Maleme. With the Western airfield in German hands and German reinforcements arriving in increasing numbers, the overall situation on the island had shifted decisively against the British. The fact that Rethymno and Heraklion remained in British hands meant nothing if the overall defense of the island was collapsing. The men at these locations found themselves not in a position of strength but in an increasingly desperate situation where their success in their own sector had become decoupled from the reality of the broader situation. They would continue to hold ground and continue to resist. They would inflict more casualties and endure more hardship, but they would do so increasingly as isolated garrisons, cut off from communication with higher command, unaware of how the broader battle was unfolding, and facing an enemy that was no longer concentrated on the capture of their specific airfields, but on the envelopment and reduction of isolated pockets of British resistance across the island. The morning of the 21st of May brought no relief to either side. German paratroopers scattered across Maleme's contested terrain found themselves in a state far removed from the coordinated assault their commanders had promised. Units that had dropped together had been separated by wind and enemy fire. Officers could not find their men. Men could not find their officers. Supply containers intended for one location landed in enemy territory or simply vanished into the chaotic landscape. Ammunition, already rationed before the first shot, was burning away at a rate no resupply aircraft could hope to match. The Germans had entered Crete with an assumption that calcified into fantasy, the assumption that surprise and speed would carry them to victory before supply became consequential. By the second day of the invasion, supply had become everything. The British garrison, despite its exhaustion and scattered disposition, possessed advantages the Germans could not overcome without a steady flow of reinforcements and ammunition. Freyberg had positioned his men to contest every airfield, every approach, every village that could serve as an assembly point for German forces. At Maleme, the New Zealand troops who had withdrawn from portions of the airfield had nonetheless maintained contact with German forces and continued to inflict casualties. Around Rethymno and Heraklion, British and Commonwealth units had repulsed the initial German landings with such ferocity that paratroopers were reporting themselves surrounded, cut off from any supply line, and under sustained rifle and machine gun fire. These were not the conditions under which an airborne force could consolidate and expand its beachhead. These were the conditions under which airborne forces simply died. General Kurt Student, commanding the operation from an airfield in occupied Greece, confronted a dilemma that had no clean solution. His transport fleet could not land at Maleme in sufficient strength, while the airfield remained under British fire. At Rethymno and Heraklion, the airfields were still entirely in British hands, making any attempt to land reinforcements suicidal. German paratroopers were calling for supplies that could not be delivered, requesting reinforcements that could not be landed, and asking for relief that existed only in optimistic planning documents. Yet the operation had to continue. To halt the assault, to consolidate, and wait for conditions to improve was to surrender the one advantage the Germans still possessed: momentum, however fragile and however desperate. The men on the ground understood their precarious situation with brutal clarity. German paratroopers had been trained for rapid assault, for the shock of unexpected arrival, for the overwhelming of surprised defenders. They had not been trained for sustained defensive operations against an enemy that knew they were coming and had prepared accordingly. Ammunition was distributed with an eye toward rationing. Officers ordered men to cease fire unless targets presented themselves at very close range. The noise of rifle and machine gun fire that had characterized the first day of invasion began, by the second day, to diminish, not because the fighting had lessened, but because ammunition discipline was now a matter of survival. Men lay in shallow positions, waiting, conserving, knowing that every round fired was a round that could not be fired again. The British counteroffensives, meanwhile, suffered from a different but equally crippling constraint: the inability to coordinate action across the island. Freiburg's headquarters at Creforce could communicate with units at Maleme, Rethymno, and Heraklion, but the communication was sporadic, and the intelligence arriving from the field was fragmentary. A unit commander at Maleme might report that German forces appeared to be consolidating, but the report would reach headquarters many hours after the situation had changed. Orders dispatched from headquarters to launch a counteroffensive would arrive at battalion and company level with outdated information and without the ability to coordinate timing across multiple assault groups. One unit would advance, while another, unaware of the movement, remained in position. Assaults that should have been coordinated waves became disconnected jabs that the Germans could absorb and counter. Yet for all these constraints, British and Commonwealth forces launched furious counterattacks against German positions around Maleme airfield during the 21st and 22nd of May. New Zealand and British troops, many of them cavalry units without horses and re-equipped as infantry, fixed bayonets and advanced up the slopes surrounding the airfield. Artillery fire, limited by ammunition shortage, attempted to soften German positions before the infantry assault. When bayonets met entrenching tools and grenades, the fighting became intimate and brutal. German paratroopers, fewer in number but fighting from prepared positions, held their ground through sheer discipline and the advantage of defensive terrain. Cretan civilians, armed with captured German weapons and whatever other arms could be found, participated in these assaults, fighting to defend their own island with a ferocity that surprised and impressed British officers. The Cretan civilians who had taken up arms represented a dimension of the battle that German planners had discounted almost entirely. They were not soldiers. They had no military training, no organized chain of command. no logistics system beyond what local villages could provide. Yet they understood that a German victory on Crete would mean an occupation that would transform their lives and endure for years. They knew the terrain better than any British officer or German paratrooper. They moved through mountain passes and across hillsides with an ease that outsiders could not match. When German paratroopers attempted to move through villages or secure supply routes through civilian areas, they encountered resistance that seemed to emerge from the terrain itself. A Cretan with a rifle or a captured German weapon could cause a German patrol to halt, to take cover, to expend ammunition and time trying to locate and suppress an enemy that had melted away into stone houses or mountain crevasses. The struggle for supply and logistics during these first 3 days of battle manifested in smaller, undramatic ways that cumulated into strategic consequence. German paratroopers who needed water had to approach wells that British machine gunners covered. Supply containers that had been scattered across the landscape by wind or enemy fire had to be recovered from areas still held or contested by British forces. Wounded men accumulated in German positions with no medical supplies adequate to treat them, their condition deteriorating and their needs consuming the attention of men needed for defense. A German paratrooper wounded on the first day of the invasion was, by the third day, either dead or permanently incapacitated unless he received treatment that the German medical corps could not provide. Every casualty the Germans sustained was a casualty they could not replace. Every ammunition round expended was a round they could not regenerate. Every man left behind or killed was a man who would not stand in a formation 3 days hence. The British situation, though less immediately critical, was scarcely more sustainable. Freyberg had concentrated his force to defend 3 airfields, but the concentration had been necessary because losing any airfield was losing the ability to receive reinforcements or supplies by air. Yet defending 3 widely separated positions with forces that could not easily communicate or coordinate meant accepting that at any moment one or more of those garrisons could be isolated, surrounded, or overwhelmed. Ammunition at each location was measured in days of fighting, not weeks. Food was rationed and becoming inadequate. Men who had been pushed to the limit of their endurance during the retreat from Greece and the initial landings were being pushed beyond that limit, operating on exhaustion and adrenaline and the knowledge that failure meant not merely military defeat, but occupation and whatever that would bring to the island. For 3 days, from the 20th to the 23rd of May, the Battle of Crete existed in a state of terrible equilibrium. German forces held Maleme airfield and the surrounding terrain, but they could not expand significantly beyond it without risking what gains they had made. British and Commonwealth forces held Rethymno and Heraklion airfields and could still inflict severe casualties on German attempts to break out or capture those positions, but they could not coordinate relief operations or significant reinforcements to Maleme. The island was divided into isolated enclaves, each fighting its own war, each cut off from clear knowledge of how the larger battle was proceeding. Officers made decisions based on fragmentary information. Soldiers executed those decisions with discipline and courage, knowing that the alternative to continued fighting was surrender or death. The outcome hung suspended, dependent not on strategy or tactics alone, but on which side would break first under the weight of exhaustion and supply shortage. German reinforcements were slowly, fitfully beginning to land at Maleme airfield, despite the continued British fire and the hazardous conditions. Transport planes came in low, skimming the surface of the field, and disgorged paratroopers or supplies while under fire. Some aircraft were hit and crashed, others landed successfully and withdrew under protective fire. The flow was nothing like what German planners had hoped for on the first day, but it was flow, it was reinforcement, it was a slow accretion of strength that the British could not match. For every German paratrooper who landed at Maleme on the second and third days of the invasion, there was no corresponding arrival of fresh British troops or supplies. The reinforcements the British garrison might have expected from Egypt or other Mediterranean bases were not coming. The Mediterranean fleet was operating within the contested waters around Crete, and British commanders had judged that committing transport ships to the waters around the island would be to lose those ships without sufficient certainty of success to justify the loss. By the evening of the 23rd of May, 3 days into the invasion, the shape of the battle's conclusion was becoming clearer, though not yet inevitable. German forces, despite enormous casualties and logistical strain, had secured their foothold at Maleme. Reinforcements were arriving in increasing numbers. The British counter-offensives, coordinated only with great difficulty and executed without adequate support, had failed to retake the airfield. Freiburg was receiving intelligence reports and observations that suggested the Germans would soon have sufficient numbers and supplies to begin pressing outward from Maleme, to move toward Rethymno and Heraklion, to consolidate the scattered beachheads into an expanding occupation. The question was no longer whether the Germans would be contained at Maleme, but how long the British and Commonwealth forces could hold Rethymno and Heraklion, and whether any organized withdrawal could be mounted before the Germans achieved a breakthrough that would destroy the defending forces entirely. While the battle for Crete's airfields raged on land, a parallel struggle was unfolding across the waters of the eastern Mediterranean. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commander of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, faced a challenge that no textbook had fully prepared him for. The Germans had done something unprecedented. They were attempting to reinforce an invasion by air alone, yet they could not sustain that alone indefinitely. Supply ships, slow, vulnerable cargo vessels laden with ammunition, food, and reinforcements, would need to reach Crete if the airborne bridgehead was to hold and expand. Cunningham understood this calculus with absolute clarity. His warships were the only force that could contest German sea lanes in daylight hours, and if he did not act, the waters around Crete would become an undisputed German corridor. The decision before him was not a question of risk but of magnitude. How much of his already stretched fleet could he afford to lose in order to deny the enemy a victory? There was no comfortable answer, only the grinding mathematics of naval warfare in an age of air power. The German sea transport operation faced inherent contradictions that Cunningham was determined to exploit. The German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, was never equipped to conduct large-scale amphibious operations. The German surface fleet had been mauled in earlier campaigns, and what remained was far too valuable to risk in broad daylight against British warships. Instead, the Germans relied on converted cargo vessels, fishing boats, and small coastal craft, makeshift transport that lacked armor, speed, and armament. These vessels would have to cross the Aegean during daylight to deliver the volume of men and supplies that Operation Mercury required. The route itself was roughly 80 kilometers across open water, and during those hours of transit, every ship was exposed. Cunningham's fleet, though damaged and depleted from earlier Mediterranean campaigns, retained enough heavy firepower to turn that crossing into a gauntlet. The British admiral made his decision. He would commit his warships to interdicting German transports, knowing that the Luftwaffe would respond with every aircraft it could muster. The cost would be significant, but the cost of inaction would be the loss of Crete and, by extension, British strategic presence in the eastern Mediterranean. The first major naval engagement occurred on the 21st of May, the day after the initial airborne assault. a German transport convoy, escorted by minimal destroyer cover, was spotted moving toward Crete. British warships, including cruisers and destroyers, moved to intercept. The engagement was brief and devastating for the Germans. Several transport vessels were sunk, including ships carrying reinforcements and supplies critical to stabilizing the airborne bridgehead at Maleme. The losses were not merely material. The destruction of a single cargo ship represented hundreds of tons of ammunition, food, and equipment that would not reach the German paratroopers ashore. German officers in Crete, already struggling to consolidate scattered units and resupply isolated positions, received word of the losses with mounting alarm. Yet the British victory came at a cost that Cunningham would have to weigh continuously throughout the battle. His warships, operating in daylight waters, were vulnerable to attack from the air. German bombers and fighters, based on airfields in Greece and the Aegean Islands, could respond to any British surface activity. Cunningham was trading losses at sea for the denial of supplies ashore, a grim calculation that would repeat itself over the coming days. The engagement of the 22nd of May demonstrated the scale of this naval commitment and its consequences. Another German transport force attempted to reach Crete, and once again British warships moved to attack. This time, the Germans had provided stronger escort, but the British naval gunfire was relentless. At least one major transport vessel was sunk in the engagement, along with escort vessels. The cost to the British, however, was immediate and severe. German aircraft attacked the British warships, damaging several vessels and killing sailors with brutal efficiency. The Mediterranean, for all its history of classical trade and Roman fleets, had become a killing ground where capital ships could be destroyed by bombs dropped from the sky. Cunningham's crews, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns, understood what they were being asked to do. They understood that their ships were targets in a way they had never been before, vulnerable to an enemy that attacked from above where naval guns could not follow. Yet they continued to execute their admiral's orders, driven by a combination of duty, training, and the knowledge that the islands and men ashore depended on their sacrifice. The losses accumulated, damaged hulls, exhausted crews, and the slow attrition of naval power that Britain could not easily replace. By the 23rd and 24th of May, the pattern had become clear and brutal. Every attempt to disrupt German sea transport resulted in the destruction or damage of some German vessels, yet every such attempt also resulted in British losses. Admiral Cunningham faced mounting pressure from other quarters. The air officer commanding RAF forces in the Mediterranean warned that continued naval operations in daylight would draw German aircraft away from the land battle, but that this benefit came at the risk of the Navy's further decimation. Other commanders suggested that the fleet should withdraw to safer waters, accepting the loss of Crete as the price of preserving naval strength for future operations. Cunningham was not immune to these arguments, but he rejected them. His reasoning was stark and unyielding. If the fleet withdrew and German sea supply lines solidified, Crete would be lost within days, and the strategic situation in the Mediterranean would shift decisively. British forces would be pushed back toward Egypt, the initiative would pass entirely to the Axis, and the foundation for any future recovery would be undermined. He issued orders for continued operations, accepting the losses as the cost of maintaining British presence in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. The human cost of these operations was immediate and visible in ways that tactical reports could not capture. British and Allied sailors served on vessels that offered no shelter from air attack, no protection from the Luftwaffe's bombs and machine gun fire. Ships that had survived earlier campaigns in the Mediterranean were struck and sunk, their crews fighting for survival in waters far from home. The waters around Crete, became a graveyard of naval losses that would accumulate throughout the battle and beyond. Sailors who survived sinkings were picked up by other vessels, bringing with them stories of explosions, flooding, and the terrible speed with which a ship could disappear beneath the waves. Officers and men who witnessed the destruction of sister ships knew that they might face the same fate on the next patrol. Cunningham's own flagship received damage from air attack, a wound that was both symbolic and practical. The sacrifice was not abstract or distant, it was immediate, tangible, and visible to every man serving in the Mediterranean fleet. Cunningham understood that he was asking his sailors to accept the highest risks so that the battle ashore might be decided in favor of the Allies. This understanding was not something he expressed in flowery language or grand declarations. It was simply the reality that shaped every order he issued and every operation he authorized. The impact of these naval operations on the battle ashore was substantial, though not always immediately apparent to the soldiers fighting around Malaim, Rethymno, and Heraklion. German paratroopers who had expected resupply by sea found that their supply lines were interrupted or destroyed. Units that should have received reinforcements found that transport vessels carrying those men had been sunk. Ammunition shortages that plagued German positions throughout the first week of the battle were directly connected to the losses inflicted by the British fleet. Engineers and specialists, including signals personnel and medical teams, who were intended to arrive on transport ships, instead perished when those vessels were sunk. The German command structure in Crete grew increasingly alarmed about the sustainability of the operation. Orders for additional supplies were issued, yet Cunningham's fleet continued to exact a price for every attempt to deliver them. The Germans were forced to rely more heavily on airlift, increasing the burden on the already stretched Luftwaffe and further complicating the logistics of invasion. Freyberg, commanding the British land forces, was aware of these naval actions, and they influenced his assessment of the battle's trajectory. If the British fleet could maintain its interdiction of German sea transport, perhaps the airborne troops ashore could be ground down through attrition and supply shortage. Yet by the 25th of May, the question of British naval sustainability became urgent and unavoidable. Cunningham's fleet, after days of continuous operations and repeated engagements with German aircraft, had suffered enough damage that its operational capacity was severely reduced. Multiple vessels were sunk or damaged, and others required repairs that could not be performed at sea. Casualty lists mounted, killed, wounded, and missing sailors accumulated in hospital ships and medical facilities throughout the Mediterranean. Cunningham received reports of the losses with steady resolve, yet he also faced the reality that further significant losses would leave his fleet incapable of effective operations. At this juncture, a decision had to be made about the scale of continued naval engagement. Cunningham consulted with his subordinate commanders and with the Admiralty in London. The consensus was that the fleet had done what it could. Further losses on the same scale would impair naval strength for operations elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Cunningham issued new orders. The fleet would continue to contest German sea movements, but would do so with measured engagement rather than the full intensity of the previous days. The Navy would maintain a presence that could respond to major German attempts to reinforce or resupply Crete, but would not conduct the kind of repeated daylight operations that had extracted such a toll. This change in naval strategy did not mean retreat or acceptance of defeat. Rather, it represented a recalibration of risk that acknowledged the limits of what even a committed naval force could sustain. Cunningham understood that the decision to withdraw the fleet, even partially, would shape perceptions of the battle ashore. If soldiers and officers in Crete believed that the Navy had abandoned them to their fate, morale would collapse. Officers in Cairo and London, assessing the situation from reports and intelligence, might conclude that Crete was truly lost and that the evacuation phase should begin in earnest. Cunningham moved to forestall both outcomes by making clear that the fleet remained engaged in the battle and would support evacuation operations if they became necessary. He authorized specific naval forces to position themselves to provide fire support to the land campaign where practicable, and he issued standing orders for warships to respond to any major German sea operation. The message was carefully calibrated. The Navy had suffered significant losses in the defense of Crete, but those losses had meaning and purpose, and the commitment to the island's defense was not diminished, merely refined. The Mediterranean fleet's operations during the Battle of Crete established a pattern that would influence naval strategy for the remainder of the war. The lesson was brutal and clear. Surface ships operating in waters where the enemy possessed air superiority faced losses that could not be indefinitely sustained. Yet Cunningham's insistence on contesting German sea lanes, despite those losses, also demonstrated that naval power could still impose costs on an enemy, even in an age of air dominance. The transports that the British fleet sank and damaged represented supplies and men that the German paratroopers did not receive. The damage inflicted on German vessels and the loss of specialized transport craft forced the Germans to rely more heavily on improvised solutions and airlift. These losses, accumulated across the first week of the battle, contributed to the supply shortages that plagued German operations throughout the campaign. Freyberg understood this connection, and it informed his calculations about German sustainability in Crete. The cost to the British fleet was significant in absolute terms, yet measured against the stakes of the battle, it was a sacrifice that Cunningham had deemed necessary and justified. The broader implications of the fleet's engagement extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. British naval officers and sailors who served in the Mediterranean during this period understood that they had participated in a transition in naval warfare. The age of the battleship as the arbiter of sea power was ending, and the age of air power and submarine warfare was ascendant. Yet for a brief window during the Battle of Crete, surface warships had made a difference through determination and sacrifice. Cunningham's willingness to accept losses and commit his fleet, despite those losses, sent a message to his subordinates and to the broader military and political leadership about the weight that naval power could still carry. This message would resonate as the war continued and as naval strategy evolved. The losses themselves, ships sunk, sailors killed, the sheer material damage to the fleet, could not be undone, but their meaning could be shaped by context and by understanding their role in a larger struggle. In the days following the changed naval posture, the focus of the battle gradually shifted from the question of whether supply lines could be contested to the question of whether the evacuation of British forces could be executed. The Mediterranean fleet, despite its losses and reduced operational capacity, would be called upon to conduct that evacuation. Cunningham was already preparing for this contingency, allocating resources and planning routes for ships that would operate in daylight waters to extract soldiers from Crete's southern ports. The costs that the fleet had already paid in the first week of the battle would pale beside the costs that would accumulate during the evacuation phase. Yet the commitment had been made, and Cunningham's sailors understood that their role in the battle was far from finished. They had contested German sea power and imposed costs on the invasion. Now they would attempt to salvage what remained of the defeated garrison. The sacrifice was unfinished, its full measure not yet apparent, but the trajectory was clear. The Mediterranean fleet, under Cunningham's command, would see this battle through to its end, whatever that end might demand of ship and crew. 3 days had passed since the first German paratroops descended onto Crete's northern plains. 3 days of fighting that had fractured the certainty of any orderly defense into fragments of confusion, exhaustion, and impossible choices. By the 23rd of May, Major General Bernhard Freyberg sat in a headquarters that was itself becoming a monument to the speed of operational dissolution. His command stretched across an island more than 160 kilometers long, split among 3 airfields that now operated as isolated fortresses, each fighting its own battle with only occasional radio contact and diminishing faith that reinforcement or relief was coming. The information reaching him arrived in fragments, often hours old, sometimes contradictory, always incomplete. A commander accustomed to the clarity of a set-piece battle now inhabited a landscape where knowledge itself had become a luxury. At Maleme, the news was darkening by the hour. The New Zealand company that had withdrawn from the western corner of the airfield, a tactical repositioning meant to consolidate a shorter defensive line, had inadvertently opened the door that would consume the entire operation. German pilots circling overhead had read that withdrawal not as a tactical adjustment, but as a full abandonment of the position. They radioed coordinates, transport planes adjusted their approach vectors, and within hours, German reinforcements began landing on ground that the defenders believed they still controlled. By the 23rd, Maleme was no longer simply contested. It was occupied, secured, and transforming into the German springboard that Freyberg's entire defense had been designed to prevent. Every report from the Maleme sector spoke of growing German numbers, of transports continuing to land despite the fire thrown at them, of German units consolidating and expanding their perimeter. The airfield that should have been held as the critical barrier to the invasion had instead become the fortress from which the invasion was now being prosecuted. Yet Freyberg could not simply abandon Maleme to focus on defensive consolidation elsewhere. The logic of the position demanded that he attempt to recapture it, to sever the German supply line and restore the initiative that the first 3 days had promised. Reports from the Rethymno and Heraklion garrisons, isolated though they were, suggested that German paratroopers at those locations were still dispersed, still struggling, still being repulsed in small unit actions by determined British defenders and increasingly aggressive Cretan civilians who had taken up rifles, shotguns, and ancient weapons to contest the invasion. If Freyberg could stabilize Maleme and maintain the pressure at the other 2 airfields, there remained a possibility that German losses would outpace German reinforcements, that the operation might yet collapse under its own weight. But that possibility rested on a wager that the Commonwealth forces still possessed enough combat power to mount a serious offensive, and that German reinforcement rates could not overcome a coordinated push to eject them from Maleme. The ultra-intelligence that had served Freyberg so well in the first hours of invasion, warning him of the assault's timing, its scale, its focus on the northern airfields, now became a liability as much as an asset. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park had intercepted the initial invasion plan with breathtaking clarity, but plans change in contact with an enemy, and the fog of battle obscures even the clearest intelligence. Freyberg knew that German reinforcements were being assembled and staged for departure from mainland Greece, but he did not know with precision when those reinforcements would arrive, in what numbers, or whether the losses already sustained would cause German commanders to scale back their ambitions. The intelligence apparatus that had given him such an advantage at the operation's threshold could not help him now. To reveal the source of his knowledge, to act on details too precise to come from conventional reconnaissance, would compromise Ultra. And Ultra was a weapon that might be needed in 100 other battles yet to come. So Freyberg sat with information that was simultaneously too precise and too ambiguous, forced to interpret German intentions through the fog of reports from subordinates who themselves could see only the portions of the battlefield immediately around them. The isolation of his three commands was itself a strategic problem. Rethymno and Heraklion were not simply out of supporting distance from Maleme, they were out of communication with each other and only intermittently in contact with Freyberg's headquarters. Radio sets had been damaged or lost in the chaos of the airfield bombardments. Telephone lines had been cut by German strafing. The garrison commanders at those locations understood they were isolated, but isolation bred its own interpretations and fears. Was the main battle being lost at Maleme while they inflicted damage on secondary German forces, or were their successes, the counterattacks that had repulsed German paratroops, the prisoners taken, the German dead, symptoms of a German operation that was fragmenting under the weight of preparation and execution? Without clear communication, each garrison fell back on its own assessment of the larger situation, and those assessments diverged from reality with every passing hour. Freyberg's own headquarters had shifted locations twice as German air attacks intensified. The commander who needed to be at the center of decision-making found himself in a position where the center of his command had become nomadic, constantly moving to avoid the Luftwaffe's attention. This was not the static headquarters of a conventional battle. This was a command structure being subjected to the same chaos and disruption that German planners had hoped their airborne invasion would impose on the entire island. Ironically, the effect was precisely what the invasion had been designed to achieve: the degradation of command authority and the fragmentation of defensive unity. The German plan had assumed that airborne troops would land in sufficient concentration to overwhelm the initial defenders, that surprise would paralyze British responses, and that speed would prevent any coordinated counteroffensive. But the actual distribution of the drop zones, the scattering of paratroopers across the island, and the stubborn resistance of British units had frustrated those assumptions at nearly every point. The irony was that while German tactical surprise had failed, their disruption of command and control had partially succeeded simply through the geography of the battle and the limitations of communication across more than 100 kilometers of occupied terrain. By midday on the 23rd, Freyberg faced the reckoning that every commander dreads, the moment when the original plan has demonstrably failed and all choices forward are terrible. The defense of Crete had been predicated on maintaining control of the airfields long enough for either German losses to become unsustainable or for reinforcements to arrive from Egypt. Neither condition was being met. The Germans had consolidated at Maleme, and while their rate of reinforcement was constrained by the capacity of their transport fleet and the damage inflicted by the Mediterranean fleet, it was occurring. Reinforcements were landing, supplies were being landed, and the German perimeter was expanding rather than contracting. At the same time, no reinforcements were coming from Egypt. Freyberg's strength was static at best, declining as casualties accumulated and exhaustion set in. The decision before him crystallized into its starkest form. Should he commit his remaining reserves to a major offensive to retake Maleme, gambling that a concentrated blow could shatter the German position and restore the defensive strategy that had been planned? Or should he begin a fighting withdrawal, preserving his force for evacuation, accepting the loss of the island, but denying the Germans the complete annihilation of a Commonwealth army? Each choice carried its own burden. A Maleme counteroffensive would consume the last fresh units that Freyberg still controlled. If it failed, and the accumulating reports from Maleme suggested that the German position was hardening rather than weakening, then Commonwealth reserves would be exhausted, the withdrawal would become a rout, and the evacuation from the southern coast would be a catastrophe of abandonment rather than an organized extraction of force. Conversely, if he ordered a withdrawal without attempting to recapture Maleme, he would be surrendering the initiative entirely, abandoning the possibility of salvaging the situation, and essentially conceding the island while German reinforcements were still arriving and still vulnerable to a determined assault. The reports from subordinates in those hours of the 23rd carried the weight of men who had been fighting for 3 consecutive days. Combat fatigue colors judgment. It lowers thresholds for optimism and elevates thresholds for doubt. Freyberg's unit commanders, exhausted from sleepless nights and continuous contact with the enemy, were almost unanimous in their assessment that Maleme was no longer retakeable. But was that exhaustion speaking, or was it sound military judgment? There was no way for Freyberg to know without being present at the positions himself, and leaving his headquarters to visit forward areas would further compromise his already tenuous grip on the broader situation. The commander of an island-wide battle must remain at the center of information flow, even when that center is moving and fragmenting. The cost of leaving it, even for a few hours, was the risk that critical decisions would drift into the hands of subordinates who could not see the whole picture. Crete was being defended not as a unified operation, but as a collection of semi-autonomous battles. The New Zealand division held positions around Maleme and was attempting to coordinate with British forces, attempting to organize counterattacks. The British forces at Rethymno were in isolated positions, attacking German paratroopers who were scattered and disorganized, but growing in number as more transports landed. The garrison at Heraklion had inflicted the heaviest German casualties of the entire operation, but those successes were leading nowhere except to a steady attrition of its own strength. The Cretan civilians, who had emerged as the 4th combat element of the defense, were fighting with improvised weapons and an understanding of the terrain that gave them tactical advantages in small engagements. But they too were isolated, operating in their own villages and mountain regions, not as part of any coordinated strategy. Freyberg understood that his intelligence advantage, the knowledge conveyed through ultra-intercepts, was not translating into tactical advantage because the information was becoming obsolete at the very moment it was being transmitted. The plans that German codebreakers had revealed were being modified in real time, adapted to the actual conditions of the invasion, the unexpected resistance, the losses sustained, and the opportunities appearing. By the 23rd, the original plan for Operation Mercury was no longer the plan being executed. The operation had developed its own momentum, driven by the initiative of subordinate commanders, the constraints of supply, and the stubborn refusal of Commonwealth forces to collapse. The Germans were fighting an invasion that had survived its first critical hours, that had secured a foothold at Maleme, and that now faced the problem of expanding that foothold against a defender who still possessed enough strength to make any expansion costly. In those hours of the 23rd of May, Freyberg was confronting the central burden of command in a battle where the commander cannot see the battlefield. He was reduced to interpreting reports from subordinates, to weighting the credibility of fragmentary intelligence, to gambling on estimates of German strength and Commonwealth capability that were necessarily incomplete. The ultra-intelligence that should have provided clarity instead illuminated the vast spaces of what he did not know. His reserves were shrinking, his isolation was deepening, and the decision before him, to attack or to withdraw, admitted no good answer, only choices between degrees of failure and different calculi of survival. By nightfall on the 23rd, Freyberg had begun to accept that Crete could not be held, but he had not yet surrendered the possibility that a coordinated offensive might still disrupt the German consolidation. That decision, and the desperate counteroffensive that would flow from it, remained suspended between hope and resignation, waiting for the dawn that would force choice into action. By the 23rd of May, Crete's fate hung on a single strip of broken concrete and dust. Maleme airfield, seized piecemeal by German paratroops over 2 grinding days, represented the last viable foothold for German reinforcement and resupply. General Freiberg had watched this catastrophe unfold from his headquarters with the clarity that ultra-intelligence provided and the helplessness that operational isolation demanded. His commanders in the field understood only fragments of the larger picture. At Maleme, a New Zealand unit had withdrawn from part of the airfield not because they had been decisively beaten, but because ammunition ran short, the men were spent, and the position seemed impossible to hold. German observers had interpreted this tactical retreat as a full collapse. Within hours, German transport planes had begun landing on the partially secured runway, disgorging fresh paratroopers and mountain troops to reinforce the shallow beachhead. What should have been a catastrophic failure for the German operation had instead become its turning point, and British commanders now faced a choice that would determine whether Crete could be saved or whether the island was already lost. Freiberg resolved to retake Maleme. It was the decision of a man who understood the mathematics of the situation, but refused to accept them as final. If Maleme remained in German hands, the island could not be held. Every hour that the airfield remained operational allowed more enemy reinforcements to land, more supplies to accumulate, and more German strength to congeal into a position of dominance. A counteroffensive to retake the airfield would be costly and would consume what remained of his mobile reserves, but the alternative was a slow, grinding defeat, as German numbers swelled beyond the capacity of his men to resist. The British garrison at Heraklion was fighting brilliantly and inflicting fearsome losses on German paratroopers, but it was isolated and growing weaker. The force at Rethymno was holding firm but similarly cut off. Only at Maleme could the balance be tipped. Freiberg ordered his reserve brigades to concentrate for an assault. The men selected for this attack were among the finest troops available. New Zealand soldiers who had already fought through Greece and knew the price of retreat. British infantry who had endured the chaos of the evacuation from the mainland. And Cretan volunteers who fought for their own soil. They would attack with what they had: rifles, bayonets, a handful of machine guns, and the desperate hope that speed and ferocity could overcome German prepared positions. The assault began in the darkness before dawn on the 25th of May, as pre-dawn light turned the eastern sky a pale grey and the first crickets fell silent. Commonwealth units advanced toward German positions arrayed around the captured airfield, moving through rough terrain that offered minimal cover and where every movement could be detected by alert defenders. The German paratroopers and mountain troops had spent 2 days consolidating their hold on Maleme. They had dug weapon pits, established interlocking fields of fire, and positioned their machine guns to cover the most likely approach routes. Yet they were also scattered, depleted, and acutely aware that they were being attacked by an enemy that outnumbered them at this moment, and that their survival depended entirely on preventing the British from retaking the airfield. As the New Zealand battalions pressed forward, opening fire at close range, the night erupted into a frenzy of small arms fire, the sharp crack of rifles mingling with the heavier stammer of machine guns. German defenders fell back under the weight of the assault, yielding ground grudgingly, fighting from one position to the next. For a few hours, the British counter-offensive gained momentum. German units reported to their commanders that they were under severe pressure. that British numbers seemed to grow with each passing minute, and that they might be overrun if reinforcements did not arrive immediately. But those reinforcements were already in motion. German transport planes were landing on Maleme airfield with regularity, disgorging mountain troops who had been held in reserve in Greece specifically for this moment. These fresh troops moved quickly into the battle, establishing new defensive lines behind the positions that were collapsing under British pressure. The mathematics of the fight shifted as German strength accumulated faster than British reserves could be committed. What had seemed like a breakthrough became a stalemate, and the stalemate transformed into a slow, agonizing retreat as German fire grew heavier and British ammunition began to run critically short. The men attacking Maleme had not slept properly in days. Many had not eaten since the previous evening. Their uniforms were caked with dust and dried sweat, and their eyes burned with exhaustion. Yet they continued to press forward, because the alternative was to accept that Crete was lost, and that every man fighting here would either be killed or captured. For nearly 6 hours, the battle raged across the broken terrain of Maleme airfield, with neither side yielding decisively, and both sides bleeding away irreplaceable strength. By mid-morning, the momentum of the British assault had dissipated entirely. German reinforcements were landing at a rate that overwhelmed the Commonwealth ability to inflict casualty losses that the invaders could not replace. The new troops arriving from the air were not exhausted paratroopers who had jumped into chaos. They were mountain infantry from the 7th Flieger Division, trained, organized, and equipped. They came in waves, each wave allowing the Germans to extend their lines and reinforce their threatened positions. The British commanders on the ground understood that the moment for victory had passed. The men attacking Maleme had done everything that could reasonably be demanded of them. They had launched an assault against prepared positions held by an enemy with growing numbers and air support. They had nearly broken through, had pushed German defenders back, and had come close to recapturing the airfield. But close was not enough. In war, as in mathematics, the difference between success and failure is often measured in small increments and marginal advantages. On the morning of the 25th of May, the margin had shifted irreversibly against the British. The assault that had consumed the reserves could not be renewed. The failure of the Maleme counteroffensive broke something essential in the strategic situation. Freyberg had committed the bulk of his remaining mobile reserves to retake the airfield, believing that possession of Maleme was the key to holding Crete. The assault had come closer to success than any subsequent attempt would, and in another war, against another enemy, it might have succeeded. But against German paratroopers being steadily reinforced by air, the attack had consumed strength that could not be recovered. When the assault fell back, when the decision was made to cease the counteroffensive, rather than throw more men into a battle that could not be won, the underlying reality became inescapable. Crete could no longer be defended. German numbers were growing daily. Air support would increase as the Luftwaffe consolidated its grip on the Mediterranean. The 3 British garrisons were isolated from one another, cut off by German forces that were growing stronger and more cohesive with each passing hour. Ammunition was running short across the island. Food was becoming scarce. Men were collapsing from exhaustion and dehydration. The choice that faced Freyberg was no longer whether Crete could be held, but how best to preserve his force from annihilation. The cost of the failed counteroffensive extended beyond the men and ammunition expended in the assault itself. The attack had consumed the psychological momentum that had sustained Commonwealth forces through 2 days of desperate fighting. Men who had held positions against overwhelming odds, who had seen their comrades fall and had continued to fight, now understood that their sacrifice might be for nothing. The garrisons at Heraklion and Rethymno had inflicted fearsome casualties on German paratroopers, had held their ground against every attempt to dislodge them, and had done everything within their power to support the defense of Crete. But they were isolated, and the failure at Maleme meant that relief would never come. The men at those airfields understood, even without explicit orders, that they were now fighting for no purpose beyond the honor of resistance and the denial of an easy German victory. That knowledge changed something in the way men fought, in the calculations they made about when to hold and when to retreat, in their understanding of what sacrifice meant when the larger battle was already lost. The German commanders, observing the collapse of the British counteroffensive and the failure of Commonwealth forces to retake Maleme, understood that they had passed a critical threshold. The operation that had seemed so audacious 2 days earlier, so dependent on achieving surprise and rapid success, had somehow endured past the point where it should have failed. General Kurt Student, the architect of Operation Mercury, received reports that his forces were consolidating around Maleme and that reinforcements were arriving in sufficient quantities to secure the airfield as a permanent foothold. German planners had feared that the British would retake Maleme, that airborne troops scattered across the island would be overwhelmed before enough reinforcements could land. Yet here they were, past the critical phase, with control of the airfield secured and fresh troops arriving by the hour. The cost had been staggering. German casualties among the paratroopers had reached levels that approached disaster. Entire units had been reduced to half strength or less. The glider-borne troops had suffered especially heavily, many of them killed or captured in the confused fighting of the first 2 days. Yet the operation had succeeded in passing its most dangerous moment, the moment when it hung in perfect balance between triumph and catastrophe. The failure of the British counteroffensive had tipped that balance, and tipped it decisively. The men defending Maleme in those final hours of the counteroffensive were aware, at some level, that they were fighting to prevent their own annihilation. German paratroopers understood that if the British retook the airfield, their line of resupply would be severed, and they would be killed or captured within days. They fought with the desperation of men who know that defeat means death. The British and New Zealand soldiers understood that if Maleme was lost, all of Crete was lost, and they fought with the desperation of men defending their last foothold in the eastern Mediterranean. The bayonet charges and the hand-to-hand fighting that characterized the final phases of the counteroffensive reflected this clarity. Men who were too exhausted to march, too hungry to think clearly, too thirsty to speak above a whisper, somehow found the strength to charge across open ground into the fire of defenders who were equally desperate and equally determined. The fighting at Maleme became, in those hours, as brutal and as honest as war can be, stripped of all pretense and reduced to its essential nature. The collision of two forces, each certain that its survival depended on the destruction of the other. By the evening of the 25th of May, the counteroffensive had spent itself entirely. Freiburg's reserves had been committed, and they had failed to achieve their objective. German reinforcements continued to arrive, and the airfield remained in enemy hands. The failure was not dishonorable, and the assault itself had been mounted with courage and tactical skill. But failure it was nonetheless, and failure in this context meant that the defense of Crete had entered its final phase. The garrisons would continue to fight, and they would continue to inflict casualties on German forces. But they would now be fighting in the knowledge that their ultimate defeat was assured, that the only question remaining was the manner and the timing of that defeat. For the men in the ranks, the failure of the counteroffensive meant that they might not survive what was coming next. For Freiburg, it meant that he had no choice but to begin planning for withdrawal and evacuation. For Germany, It meant that despite the staggering costs and the unexpected ferocity of British resistance, Operation Mercury had succeeded. The airborne invasion had carried the day, and the largest airborne operation yet attempted in warfare had achieved its objective through a combination of audacity, sacrifice, and the margins by which battles are won and lost. By the 24th of May, the soldiers at Heraklion and Rethymno understood what the men at Maleme had begun to grasp. They were alone. The wireless sets crackled with fragmentary messages from Freiburg's headquarters, each transmission more distant and less reassuring than the last. The commanding officers at both airfields had pressed their advantages on the 20th and 21st, driving German paratroopers back into scattered pockets, inflicting casualties that seemed to promise eventual collapse of the invasion. Yet as the morning of the 24th broke over the Cretan hills, the tenor of the battle shifted. The Germans who had survived the initial drop were consolidating. Those airfields controlled by the enemy became funnels for reinforcement and supply. The isolation that now settled upon Heraklion and Rethymno was not a temporary condition, but a permanent fact of the emerging tactical landscape. The men dug deeper into their positions, checked their ammunition reserves, and began to face the arithmetic of their situation. They could inflict damage on the enemy, but they could not escape. At Heraklion, roughly 6,000 soldiers of mixed British, Australian and Greek units held the airfield itself and the town that surrounded it. The position was stronger than Maleme in many respects. The defending forces had received clearer warning of the invasion, had time to prepare entrenchments and fire zones, and had not been compelled to withdraw from their principal positions. When the German paratroopers descended on the 20th, they fell into a maelstrom. Anti-aircraft guns, hastily repurposed to anti-personnel fire, raked the transport planes. Rifles cracked from every prepared position. The scattered German units that managed to land and assemble were driven back repeatedly. For 2 days, the men of Heraklion believed they were winning. They moved against German pockets in the surrounding terrain, pressed counterattacks, and seemed to be reducing the threat piece by piece. Some soldiers wrote letters home in those brief moments between actions, expressing confidence that the invasion would be crushed. Yet those letters would not be sent. By the evening of the 23rd, German forces had not advanced significantly, but they had not been destroyed either. More troubling still, the radio reports from Maleme suggested catastrophe. The officers at Heraklion learned that the airfield in the west had been abandoned, or so it seemed, and that German reinforcements were landing there in increasing numbers. No orders came to withdraw. No clarification arrived about what Freiburg intended. The men of Heraklion settled into a new reality. They were a garrison under siege, not a forward element of a coordinated defense. The situation at Rethymno, roughly midway between Maleme and Heraklion, presented a grimmer picture still. Approximately 1,500 British and Australian soldiers held the airfield and its immediate approaches, but unlike their comrades to the east, they faced German forces that had consolidated more successfully in the surrounding hills. The German paratroopers dropped at Rethymno had suffered terribly in the initial assault, but those who survived had linked up and established defensive positions in the high ground overlooking the field. The British and Australian defenders of Rethymno had pushed back hard on the 20th and 21st, inflicting losses and preventing German consolidation near the runway itself. Yet the geography of the position worked against them. The airfield sat in terrain that allowed the Germans to encircle it. With each passing day, the radius of German control expanded. Supply routes from Rethymno westward toward Maleme became increasingly dangerous. The men defending Rethymno could see smoke rising from the west, where Maleme burned and German aircraft came and went with regularity. The isolation at Rethymno was more complete than at Heraklion, because the geography and the German dispositions already precluded any relief column. The soldiers understood this intuitively. They strengthened their defences around the airfield, conserved ammunition, and waited for orders that did not come. Communication between the three isolated garrisons and Freiburg's headquarters was never robust, and by the 24th it had become intermittent to the point of uselessness. The wireless equipment was damaged or low on power. The weather and the mountainous terrain made transmission unreliable. More fundamentally, Freiburg himself was struggling to maintain coherent command of forces that were no longer coordinated in any practical sense. At his headquarters, the commander received reports from each garrison that were hours old by the time they arrived, fragmentary in detail, and often contradicted by conflicting accounts from other sources. He knew that Maleme was lost. He could infer that Heraklion and Rethymno were becoming isolated. Beyond that, the fog of battle obscured almost everything. The garrisons at Heraklion and Rethymno knew even less. They heard rumours. They pieced together scraps of radio traffic. They saw German aircraft coming and going from the west in increasing numbers. But they could not know whether Freiburg was planning a counter-offensive to relieve them, whether reinforcements were coming from Egypt, or whether they were simply being written off as a sacrifice to buy time for the withdrawal of other forces. This uncertainty was perhaps harder to bear than clear orders to hold to the last man or to retreat. The soldiers endured in an informational vacuum, doing their jobs, conserving resources, and trying not to contemplate what isolation truly meant. Yet both garrisons continued to inflict punishment on German attempts to consolidate and break out toward the west. At Heraklion, the defense was organized around the perimeter of the airfield itself and the town immediately to its south. The German units in the surrounding hills pressed forward on the 24th and 25th, seeking to close the encirclement and prevent any possibility of relief. The British and Australian defenders met these assaults with carefully controlled fire, conserving ammunition and taking aim only when targets were clear. The German attacks came in waves, probing for weak points in the British line. Some assaults penetrated partway into the British perimeter before being thrown back. The fighting was fierce and close, sometimes hand to hand. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the British held. The German forces never succeeded in overrunning the airfield or breaking through the defense. The men of Heraklion, though cut off and without hope of relief, prevented the enemy from consolidating a victory on their ground. This feat of arms went largely unrecognized at the time, overshadowed by the catastrophe at Maleme, but it was no less consequential for the overall outcome of the battle. The situation at Rethymno was more desperate because the German encirclement was more complete and the garrison was smaller. Roughly 1,500 soldiers faced German forces that held the initiative in the surrounding terrain and whose numbers grew daily as stragglers from the original drop consolidated or new forces arrived by air. The men of Rethymno mounted counterattacks when ammunition and numbers permitted, seeking to break out westward toward Maleme or to prevent the Germans from closing their encirclement entirely. These attacks were costly and often failed to achieve their objectives. Yet they continued to delay German movements and inflict losses that compounded the strain on German resources. The soldiers of Rethymno understood the bleakness of their situation more acutely than their comrades at Heraklion. Heraklion was connected to the sea and might, theoretically, be evacuated by naval vessels. Rethymno, inland and surrounded, offered no such possibility. The men fought with the knowledge that they were likely to be captured or killed, and that no relief was coming. This knowledge did not diminish their resistance, but rather hardened it. They would inflict a cost on the enemy for every kilometer of ground surrendered. They would hold as long as ammunition remained and limbs could move. Water and food became critical issues as the siege tightened around both garrisons. Heraklion had access to the town's cisterns and some stored supplies, but nothing intended to sustain 6,000 men for an extended siege. The rations that had been intended for a few days of operations stretched thin. Men began to experience the symptoms of hunger and thirst intensely. Heraklion's defenders rationed water strictly, and as days passed without resupply, the issue became urgent. At Rethymno, the situation was worse. The airfield had minimal stored supplies, and the surrounding heights controlled by Germans cut off access to additional resources from the town. The men there began to face genuine scarcity by the 25th and 26th. Wounded soldiers, of whom there were hundreds, received priority for what little water and food were available, but they too went hungry and thirsty. The combination of combat stress, heat, and deprivation wore on the men physically and psychologically. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and morale as the reality of their situation became undeniable. Yet they succeeded in holding their lines, in part because surrender seemed to offer no better prospect than continued resistance. The Cretan civilians in the towns and villages surrounding both airfields played a crucial role in the survival of the garrisons, though their contributions were often informal and unrecorded. Inhabitants of Heraklion and the surrounding area brought food, water, and information to the British and Australian soldiers when they could do so without placing themselves in immediate danger. They provided information about German movements. They guided soldiers to positions of cover. They cared for wounded men who could not be accommodated in the limited medical facilities available to the military. At Rethymno, the involvement of civilians was necessarily more circumspect because German forces held more of the surrounding terrain, but it remained crucial. The Cretans understood that German occupation would be brutal and lengthy, and that the presence of British and Australian soldiers fighting on the island offered at least a symbolic resistance to this fate. These civilians risked execution if discovered helping enemy soldiers, yet many did so anyway. Their contributions were small in tactical terms but vast in human terms. They demonstrated a form of resistance that transcended the immediate battle and reached toward the longer occupation that would follow. Radio contact between Heraklion and Rethymno became increasingly difficult as German forces pressed closer and wireless sets deteriorated. The two garrisons, which might have coordinated some response had they been able to communicate, remained isolated from each other as well as from headquarters. Officers at each position were forced to make tactical decisions based on incomplete information, uncertain whether their comrades at the other garrison still held their positions or had been forced to withdraw. This isolation worked to the Germans' advantage in some respects because it prevented coordinated breakout attempts or concentrated defensive strategies. Yet it also meant that neither garrison received clear orders about their ultimate purpose. Were they to hold until relieved? Were they to break out and fight their way west? Were they to defend to the last man? The absence of clear directives forced each garrison's commanders to improvise and to rely on their understanding of broader military principle, that an airborne force in possession of airfields could not be allowed to consolidate unchallenged, and that every day of resistance tied down enemy forces and delayed German plans. By the 26th of May, both garrisons had fought for 6 days with minimal resupply and without hope of relief. The men were exhausted, thirsty, hungry, and carrying wounds that could not be properly treated. Ammunition was running dangerously low. The Germans pressed attacks with increasing intensity, sensing that the end was approaching, yet neither garrison surrendered. At Heraklion, the commanding officers began to receive signals, fragmentary and uncertain, that suggested evacuation by sea might be possible. At Rethymno, no such possibility existed, and the men there understood their likely fate. The garrisons had inflicted losses on the Germans far exceeding what any reasonable calculation would have predicted. German paratroopers had been shot down in their chutes. Scattered landing groups had been surrounded and annihilated. The German forces that eventually broke through and invested the airfields had paid a terrible price. Yet the arithmetic of war is not measured in heroism. German reinforcements continued to land. Maleme remained in German hands. The western part of the island was increasingly in German control. The isolation of Heraklion and Rethymno was no longer an immediate reality but a permanent condition. The men would continue to fight, and the Germans would continue to press, and the outcome was no longer in doubt. Yet both garrisons would continue to contest the ground, inflicting damage and delaying the consolidation of German control until orders to withdraw or surrender came down, and even then they would extract a final cost for every step they yielded. The symbolic meaning of the continued resistance at Heraklion and Rethymno exceeded its tactical significance. These garrisons represented the principle that British forces, though defeated in Greece and nearly defeated in Crete, would not break under pressure or dissolve into panic. The men holding these positions had experienced the shock of airborne invasion, the chaos of a new form of warfare, and the terror of encirclement. Many had endured the Greek campaign, had retreated from the mainland, and had arrived on Crete as exhausted reserves pressed into hasty defense. Yet they held. German officers remarked on the toughness of the British defense at Heraklion and Rethymno. The German commanders had anticipated that the shock of airborne invasion would break British morale, and that resistance would collapse once the initial surprise wore off. Instead, they encountered an enemy that seemed to grow more resolute as the battle extended. The men at these garrisons were not equipped with better weapons or supplied with greater resources than their comrades. They possessed something less tangible, a determination to deny the enemy an easy victory, to make the cost of conquest measurable in blood and effort, and to preserve their own sense of honor and martial competence even in defeat. This spirit, though it could not change the ultimate outcome of the battle, would shape how that battle was remembered and what lessons subsequent generations would draw from it. By the 26th of May, the mathematics of survival had become impossible to ignore. General Bernhard Freyberg stood in his command post, a modest stone building inland from the northern coast, receiving reports that painted an ever-darkening portrait of the battle's true state. Maleme Airfield, the hinge upon which everything had turned, remained in German hands despite 3 days of ferocious British counterattacks. More than that, German transport aircraft continued to land reinforcements on that strip, with mounting regularity, each landing craft disgorging fresh paratroopers and supplies that shifted the balance further from equilibrium. To the east, at Rethymno and Heraklion, the British garrisons fought with undiminished courage, but they had become isolated pockets, cut off from coordinated support and surrounded by German units that grew stronger with each passing day. The ultra-intelligence that had once been Freyberg's greatest advantage had become a source of mounting anxiety rather than reassurance. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park could warn him of what was coming, but they could not tell him how many German soldiers would survive the landings, how quickly the Luftwaffe would restore its aerial dominance, or whether the Royal Navy could continue to contest the waters around Crete without suffering crippling losses that would undermine Britain's wider Mediterranean strategy. What had seemed a possibility on the morning of the invasion, that airborne troops landing into prepared defences might be thrown back into the sea, had become an increasingly distant fantasy. The Germans had absorbed punishing casualties, losses so severe that Hitler would later order the abandonment of large-scale airborne operations. Yet loss and victory were not opposites in this calculus. The Germans had lost thousands of men and could not easily replace them, but they had also captured the most critical piece of terrain on the island. As each day passed, that advantage compounded. More transport aircraft arrived from the Greek mainland, carrying ammunition, food, and reinforcements drawn from occupation forces elsewhere in Greece. The Maleme airfield, once a potential turning point for British counter-offensive, had become a conveyor belt of German consolidation. Freyberg's intelligence officers reported that German strength near Maleme now exceeded 10,000 men, with more arriving every 12 hours. Against this gathering force, the Commonwealth troops available for counterattack were numbered in the hundreds, not thousands, and they were running low on ammunition. Every shell fired was a shell not available for the next defensive line. Every man committed to an attack was a man who could not be moved to the withdrawal points at Sfakia. The cost of holding Crete had become measurable in terms that made continued resistance seem less a matter of honor and more a matter of logic. The three airfields could no longer be held simultaneously. The Heraklion and Rethymno garrisons, brave and unbowed as they remained, were doomed to either encirclement or breakout. Communication with them had grown sporadic and uncertain, filtered through wireless operators who struggled with fading batteries, and the simple fact that the military telephone exchanges that had once connected the three defensive sectors had fallen silent days ago. To maintain a coherent defense of the entire island would require reinforcements that existed nowhere in the Mediterranean. Fighter aircraft could not be spared from North Africa or Egypt. Additional paratroops existed only in German training depots. New Zealand and British reserves that might have tipped the scales had been squandered in the counterattack around Maleme, where they had fought with extraordinary bravery but could not overcome the combination of German numbers and German air support. Freyberg had to confront a reality that few commanders find themselves forced to accept so starkly, that further resistance, however valiant, would serve no strategic purpose and would only result in the useless destruction of his command. Yet the decision to withdraw carried its own weight and peril. To order a retreat in the face of an enemy still capable of pursuit was to risk the very annihilation that withdrawal was meant to prevent. A disorganized retreat could become a rout, could dissolve into panic, where soldiers threw away weapons and discipline evaporated in the face of exhaustion and fear. The mountain terrain that would protect the withdrawal could also become a trap if German forces moved quickly enough to cut off retreat routes. The port of Sfakia, where evacuation ships were supposed to assemble, was more than 40 kilometers from the forward positions at Maleme, a distance that an army in retreat might cover in 2 days under ideal conditions, but which could take twice that long if harassed by an aggressive pursuit. The Mediterranean Sea, once a highway for British warships defending the island, had become a gauntlet for evacuation vessels. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies during daylight hours, and Admiral Cunningham had made it clear that the Royal Navy could not sustain losses at the rate that current operations required if warships were to continue operating throughout the Mediterranean. Freyberg knew that the evacuation, if it came at all, would be costly and incomplete. What made the decision to withdraw not merely possible but necessary was Freyberg's understanding that withdrawal itself could be turned into an act of defiance. A fighting retreat was not the same as a rout. An organized evacuation was not the same as surrender. If the Commonwealth forces could move south in a controlled manner, maintaining rearguard positions that delayed German pursuit, then the withdrawal could preserve enough force to deny Hitler the complete victory that his propagandists had already begun to trumpet. If Freiburg could extract even half his force, even a third of it, then Crete's invasion would stand as a costly German success, not a triumph. The paratroopers and glider-borne soldiers who had descended on the island with such confidence had already paid a terrible price. The losses inflicted by the garrisons at Rethymno and Heraklion, the fierce resistance at Malines despite the ultimate loss of the airfield, had shattered the myth of airborne invincibility. If Freiburg could add to that cost by conducting a disciplined retreat, then the battle's ultimate meaning might be altered, might become a cautionary tale rather than a German showcasing of a new form of warfare. On the evening of the 26th of May, Freiburg issued the order to withdraw. It was not phrased as a retreat or a defeat. It was presented as a fighting withdrawal to the south coast, where evacuation would be attempted. The order specified that all units were to maintain defensive formations, with rearguard elements fighting delaying actions to slow German pursuit. New Zealand and British troops were to conduct the withdrawal in stages, not as a panicked flight, but as a disciplined recession toward the coast. Cretan volunteers and local forces were to harass the German columns and create obstacles that would further impede pursuit. Supply dumps that could not be evacuated were to be destroyed, denying the Germans the benefit of captured resources. Officers were given explicit instructions to maintain the cohesion of their units and to ensure that stragglers were not left entirely to their own devices, though Freiburg also recognized that some men would inevitably be separated from their units in the chaos of withdrawal and retreat. The order was communicated down through the chain of command by runner where wireless contact had failed, ensuring that even the most isolated detachments received clear instructions about where to move and in what manner. The decision to withdraw represented something more than mere military necessity. Though necessity was the foundation upon which it rested, it represented an acknowledgement that the battle for Crete, while not over, had moved into a new phase. The phase of defense was ending. The phase of survival was beginning. The evacuation points on the south coast were not guaranteed safety. Thousands of men might still be captured if the withdrawal failed, or if German forces moved with sufficient speed and coordination to cut off the main body. Yet without the order to withdraw, without the organized movement south, those men would face not merely capture, but annihilation. The Luftwaffe would continue bombing, the German infantry would continue pressing, and exhausted soldiers would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer German superiority in manpower and air support. By choosing withdrawal, by ordering it as a disciplined operation, rather than allowing it to occur as a chaotic collapse, Freiburg was choosing the least terrible of the available options. In that choice lay both the final defeat and the seeds of a qualified moral victory. The troops who received the withdrawal orders understood what they meant without requiring explicit explanation. The battle for Crete was being surrendered, at least in terms of holding the island. What would not be surrendered was the demonstration that German airborne forces, for all their innovation and courage, could be made to pay a terrible price for their victories. The men who had stood at Malines, who had fought at Rethymno and Heraklion, who had conducted desperate counterattacks, knowing that the cause might already be lost, could march south, knowing that they had not failed out of cowardice or incompetence. They had failed because they faced an enemy with air superiority and numerical advantage, an enemy supported by aircraft and reinforcements that the British could not counter. Yet within that defeat lay a vindication of sorts. German casualties were staggering. German operational doctrine had proven more fragile than its architects had believed. The loss of the island would be tactically German, but strategically it would be more ambiguous. And that ambiguity would shape how both sides understood airborne warfare in the years to come. The logistics of the withdrawal presented their own grim arithmetic. 30,000 men could not be evacuated in a single night. Ships could carry perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 men per operation, and those operations would have to occur under German air attack during daylight hours, if they were to occur at all after dark. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies, and the Royal Navy, depleted by weeks of fighting, had limited capacity to defend the waters around evacuation ports. Freiburg had to prioritize which units would be evacuated first and in what order. Wounded men would go first, naturally, along with those troops who had suffered the heaviest casualties and required immediate evacuation. But that left thousands of healthy soldiers who would have to march south on foot, through terrain that was rugged and sometimes hostile, without guarantee that ships would arrive in sufficient numbers to evacuate them all. Some would inevitably be left behind, either captured in the final German sweep or forced to hide in the mountains and hope that resistance networks could sustain them until liberation came. The weight of those calculations fell on Freiburg, on a commander who had already made the decision to abandon an island and now had to manage the consequences of that decision. The actual movement south began quietly on the evening of the 26th and intensified over the following days. Units disengaged from their defensive positions, burning what could not be carried, leaving behind minefields and booby traps to slow German pursuit. The roads leading south were congested with soldiers on foot, mules carrying ammunition and supplies, and the occasional vehicle that had somehow survived the weeks of bombing and combat. The march became a test of endurance that matched any combat the men had already experienced. Soldiers who had fought continuously for nearly a week with minimal food and water now had to traverse 40 or more kilometers on foot, across mountain passes, and through villages that had themselves been damaged by bombing. Exhaustion became as much an enemy as the German forces pursuing from the north. Men collapsed along the roads and had to be helped up by their comrades or left to find their own way or be captured. Cretan civilians, despite their own suffering and the danger of harboring soldiers, emerged from villages and farmsteads to offer water, food, and directions. Some actively joined the withdrawal, carrying weapons and ammunition to strengthen rearguard positions. The retreat became as much a story of civilian courage as of military discipline. The rearguard actions that slowed the German pursuit were brief but bloody. New Zealand and British units, reduced in strength but still organized, would take up positions on mountain passes and hold them for hours or even days, inflicting casualties on German pursuers and then withdrawing to the next prepared position. These engagements were not meant to be won, but to impose delay and cost on the Germans. A company of soldiers holding a position for a day bought thousands of their comrades an extra day to march south. A rearguard that inflicted 20 casualties on a German pursuit company while suffering 5 losses of its own, had accomplished its mission, even if it had ultimately to retreat. The soldiers who fought in these rearguard actions understood that they were fighting a different battle than the one they had fought for defense of the airfields. This was not about holding ground, it was about buying time. Yet the understanding did not diminish the ferocity of the fighting, or the willingness of men to sacrifice themselves for comrades they would likely never see again. By the 28th of May, the withdrawal was well underway, but far from complete. The lead elements of the retreating forces were arriving at Sfakia and other southern ports, where ships were beginning to assemble to conduct the evacuation. Yet the vast majority of the Commonwealth forces remained on the roads and mountain passes of southern Crete, still miles away from the sea, still vulnerable to German air attack and German pursuit. Freyberg himself had moved his command post south to the coast, where he could direct evacuation operations and maintain contact with naval commanders about the timing and numbers of evacuees. The decision to withdraw had been made and was being executed, but its success or failure would not be determined until ships had loaded soldiers and sailed from Cretan waters without being sunk by Luftwaffe bombers. The battle was no longer primarily about holding terrain or defeating enemy forces. It was about escape, about denial, about whether the British could extract their force from an island that they could no longer defend. In that new phase of the battle, the Navy's role would become paramount, and the suffering of soldiers on the march would be merely the prelude to new dangers yet to come. The decision to withdraw had been made, but the mechanics of defeat now demanded everything those exhausted men possessed. On the 26th of May, word passed down through the ranks of the Commonwealth forces scattered across Crete that Maleme was lost and the battle was finished. There would be no relief, no reinforcements, no miraculous reversal. What remained was a fighting retreat across an island that had become hostile terrain, with German forces pressing from behind, and the southern coast a distant promise of salvation. General Freyberg had chosen Sfakia, a small port on Crete's southern shore, as the evacuation point, and every soldier who could move was ordered to make for that location. The distance was not overwhelming, perhaps 30 kilometers through the island's mountainous spine, but for men without food, without adequate water, and already depleted by days of combat and sleeplessness, those kilometers became a gauntlet of attrition. The German commanders, sensing victory within reach, directed their forces to pursue and harass the retreat, determined to inflict maximum damage as the British forces withdrew. Yet they had not reckoned with the terrain that would now become the Commonwealth soldiers' greatest ally and, paradoxically, their cruelest enemy. The columns began moving southward on foot as night fell, infantry units and support personnel forming ragged lines that wound through olive groves and across stone-covered slopes. There were no trucks for the wounded or for those too exhausted to continue. The retreat was a walking ordeal, and those who could not keep pace faced a choice between pressing on or falling behind to capture. Medical personnel did what they could with overwhelmed field stations, but morphine was rationed and stretchers were non-existent. The men marched in silence, broken only by the sound of boots on stone and the occasional low curse when someone stumbled. The darkness provided concealment from German aircraft, but it also meant that routes could be mistaken and columns could separate without warning. Officers and sergeants moved along the lines, encouraging men to keep going, using both firmness and whatever compassion remained in their voices. Some soldiers had been awake for more than 48 hours, their minds foggy and their bodies moving on reflex alone. When dawn came, the columns would be vulnerable again, forced to move by daylight or risk fragmenting completely. Water became the obsession that consumed every waking thought once the sun rose over the retreating columns. The route south passed through terrain that offered little shelter and fewer water sources. Men's mouths became dry and caked with dust, their throats raw from thirst. The psychological impact of water shortage became as debilitating as the physical effect. Soldiers hallucinated oases that did not exist and urged their comrades forward with whispered promises of streams they would never find. When a water source was discovered, a small spring or a collected pool of rainwater, men fought quietly to fill their canteens, understanding that discipline was all that kept the retreat from becoming a stampede. Officers rationed water when they could find it, allowing each man a few swallows and no more. a measure of cruelty that everyone accepted as necessary. Dysentery, already ravaging the column from the stress and poor food, worsened without adequate hydration. Some men fell behind simply because their bodies could no longer continue. The landscape itself seemed designed to punish them, with rocky ridges that offered no shade and valleys that trapped the heat of the Mediterranean sun. Food was equally scarce, and by the third day of the retreat, most men had consumed whatever rations they carried in their haversacks. Some units had been without organized supply for days before the withdrawal order, and they began the retreat with only what could be carried by hand. The Cretans who lived in the remote villages along the retreat routes became essential to survival. These civilians, many of whom had watched the Germans kill their sons and husbands during the invasion, risked their own lives to shelter and feed Commonwealth soldiers. A piece of bread shared from a family's meager stores, a handful of olives, water drawn from a well deep in a mountainside village. These small gifts kept men alive who would otherwise have collapsed from malnutrition and dehydration. The trust between the soldiers and the civilians was immediate and profound. There was no language for detailed conversation, but need and compassion required none. Cretan women wrapped bread in cloth and pressed it into the hands of British and Australian soldiers who appeared at their doorsteps, gaunt and hollow-eyed. The risk was enormous. If the Germans discovered that a Cretan family had harbored Commonwealth soldiers, the consequences would be execution. Yet the villages along the retreat routes became way stations of humanity in an increasingly desolate march. The rearguard actions that punctuated the retreat represented some of the most costly fighting of the entire Crete campaign. Units designated to hold positions and delay German pursuit took up positions in the hills and mountain passes, understanding that they would likely be overrun or cut off. These were often small groups, platoons, sometimes only squads, holding ground with ammunition that grew scarcer by the hour. The Germans, aggressive and pressing their advantage, launched attacks to drive through the rearguard positions and get at the main column. What developed was a pattern of desperate defenses followed by fighting withdrawals, units holding for as long as ammunition allowed before falling back to the next defensive position. The quality of the fighting was undiminished by the British decline in circumstances. If anything, the men fought with a ferocity born of understanding that they were now fighting only to survive, to buy time for the main column to reach Sfakia. German losses continued to accumulate, and their commanders became increasingly cautious, wary of the prepared positions the British seemed always to establish. The terrain that punished the retreating columns also advantaged small defensive groups who knew how to use ridges and rocky outcrops to maximum effect. By slowing the German pursuit, these rearguard units bought thousands of their comrades precious hours. The passage through the White Mountains that formed the island's spine was perhaps the worst ordeal of the entire retreat. The elevation gain was brutal for men running on fumes, and the temperature swings between day and night sapped energy that could not be replaced. At night, men huddled together for warmth, shivering on stone at altitudes where the Mediterranean climate became almost alpine. Some soldiers never rose when dawn came. Exhaustion had simply claimed them during the night. The stretcher parties that had begun the retreat dwindled as men carrying the wounded had to make the same choice between continuing forward or resting, and rest meant capture. Officers faced the impossible calculation of how many men could be carried without condemning the entire column to destruction. These were decisions that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, moral choices made in extremis that had no correct answer. The physical landscape became almost sentient in its cruelty, each step costing more effort than the last, each ridge revealing another ridge beyond it, the southern coast perpetually distant. Yet the columns pressed on, driven by the knowledge that surrender meant captivity, and that only Sfakia offered any possibility of preservation. The condition of the men deteriorated with each passing day in ways that pure exhaustion could not fully capture. Dysentery ravaged the retreating forces, and men would step aside from the line of march for a few minutes before struggling to catch up again. Infections appeared on feet rubbed raw by continuous marching, and there was no way to treat them adequately. Some men developed a kind of 1,000-yard stare, their minds partially disconnected from their bodies as a coping mechanism. Others became angry, snapping at comrades for minor infractions or simply falling silent. The psychological burden of retreat in defeat was as real as the physical suffering. These were soldiers who had come to Crete with confidence, who had fought the German invasion with courage, and who now faced the knowledge that all of that sacrifice had been insufficient. The retreat became not just a physical ordeal, but an existential one, testing not merely endurance but faith in leadership, in strategy, in the idea that fighting to the end meant something beyond mere destruction. Yet discipline held. Units stayed relatively coherent, officers maintained authority, and men continued to support one another, even as their bodies failed them one by one. The Cretan resistance to German occupation, which would become legendary in the years that followed, was already taking shape during this retreat. Young Cretans, who had fought with rifles alongside the Commonwealth soldiers, now recognized that the island would be occupied for an indefinite period. They had tasted armed resistance, and they could not accept subjugation. Some joined the main columns heading south, hoping to escape with the Commonwealth forces. Others slipped away into the mountain villages, understanding that they would become hunted men. These Cretan fighters would provide crucial support to the evacuated soldiers who could not reach Sfakia and would remain on the island, hiding in mountain caves and small villages. The relationship between the Commonwealth soldiers and the Cretan civilians that had begun during the invasion intensified during the retreat. The soldiers realized that they were witnessing a people's resistance to occupation, not merely military defeat. The Cretans, in turn, understood that the Commonwealth soldiers, despite their withdrawal, represented a connection to the wider struggle against German domination. This mutual recognition created bonds that would endure throughout the occupation and beyond, establishing patterns of cooperation that would characterize Cretan resistance for years. The southern ports began to appear as mirages that were, mercifully, real. Sfakia emerged from the coastal haze as the lead elements of the retreating columns descended the final slopes toward the sea. The town itself was small and unprepossessing, a fishing port without substantial facilities for receiving and evacuating thousands of men. Yet it represented salvation, or at least the possibility of salvation. The sight of the sea and the prospect of escape provided a psychological boost that was almost visible in the way men's steps quickened despite their exhaustion. But Sfakia also represented a terrible shortage of evacuation capacity. The Royal Navy had committed ships to the effort, but the vessels were limited, and the journey to Egypt or other safe ports was not instantaneous. Men who reached the port faced the possibility that they might not be evacuated before dawn, exposed the port to Luftwaffe attack. The beaches filled with soldiers waiting to board ship, and the sense of proximity to escape mixed with the anxiety of possible capture. Officers organized the queuing of men as efficiently as possible, but the process was chaotic and frightening. Some men found themselves unable to board on the first night and had to hide in the hills surrounding the port during daylight hours, hoping for another opportunity when darkness came again. The evacuation from Sfakia and other small ports on the southern coast represented the climax of the retreat, but it was an incomplete climax. Not all the men who reached the coast could be evacuated. Ships were sunk by German air attacks, and the number of vessels that could operate in the waters around Crete was limited by the Luftwaffe's dominance during daylight hours. The evacuation proceeded in darkness, with transport ships and destroyers rushing soldiers aboard and then racing back to sea before sunrise. The process was brutal in its efficiency. Men were packed into holds with minimal regard for comfort, and the voyage across the Mediterranean was itself dangerous, subject to attacks that might claim the ship and everyone aboard. Roughly 17,000 men were evacuated over several nights, a number that represented a significant proportion of the Commonwealth forces but left many others behind. Those left behind faced capture or an extended period as fugitives on an occupied island. The psychological impact of reaching the port but not being evacuated was profound. Men who had endured the entire retreat faced the alternative of captivity or disappearance. Yet even this incomplete success was seen as a triumph of sorts, a preservation of force that could fight again, a denial to the Germans of the complete destruction that might have been inflicted on a trapped army. The final elements of the rearguard, those who had delayed the German pursuit and ensured that the main columns could reach the coast, either escaped in the final evacuation runs or were forced to abandon the effort and slip away into the Cretan hills. Some of these men would spend the remainder of the war as fugitives, supplied by Cretans who risked execution to shelter them. Others would be captured in the days and weeks following the main evacuation. The Germans, aware that substantial Commonwealth forces remained on the island, launched sweeps and patrols to hunt down stragglers and fugitives. The occupation of Crete, which was supposed to be a clean victory, became instead an ongoing security problem. The determination of the Commonwealth forces to preserve themselves through the retreat, rather than allowing themselves to be encircled and destroyed, meant that German resources would be tied up in occupation duties for years. The retreat to Sfakia, then, was not merely a military withdrawal, but a statement that the defeat was not total, that the fighting spirit of the Commonwealth forces had not been broken, and that the struggle against German occupation would continue in different forms. The men who made that retreat across the island's spine, through hunger and thirst and exhaustion, had endured an ordeal that transformed physical suffering into a kind of moral victory, a preservation of dignity in the face of military defeat. By the 26th of May, the fate of Crete's garrison was no longer a question of holding the island. It had become a question of escape. General Freyberg's decision to withdraw meant that upward of 30,000 Commonwealth soldiers, along with attached units and stragglers from the Greek campaign, would need to be lifted from the island under conditions that ranged from difficult to nearly impossible. The designated escape route lay southward, across the spine of Crete's mountains, toward the small port of Sfakia on the southern coast. Other embarkation points existed at lesser ports nearby, but Sfakia represented the Navy's best chance to mount a coordinated evacuation. The problem was stark. Ships would have to operate in daylight, in contested waters, under the constant shroud of the Luftwaffe. There would be no darkness to conceal the operation, no friendly air cover to shield the rescue vessels, and no guarantee that the German air arm would not reduce the evacuation to a catastrophe. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, the commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, understood the mathematics of the situation with brutal clarity. His warships were already depleted from weeks of combat operations and losses sustained during the Greek campaign. The cruisers and destroyers available for evacuation work were fast enough to make the journey in darkness and return before dawn, but that window of safety was narrowing. The distance from Alexandria in Egypt to Sfakia was roughly 240 kilometers, a passage that took a warship roughly 10 to 12 hours at high speed. This meant that rescue ships could depart Egypt in the late afternoon, arrive off Sfakia in the dead hours before dawn, load what men they could in perhaps 3 or 4 hours, and depart before the sun rose over the Aegean. Once daylight came, the ships would be exposed to air attack for the entire transit northward back toward Egypt. Cunningham authorized the operation knowing that losses would be severe, accepting the arithmetic of sacrifice, because the alternative, leaving the entire garrison to German capture, was unthinkable. His standing orders to the fleet were unambiguous: contest the waters, regardless of cost. The evacuation began on the 28th of May, with the first contingents of exhausted men reaching the beaches and rocky approaches to Sfakia after their grueling retreat across the island. They arrived in fragments, units scattered and depleted, many soldiers carrying wounded comrades on their backs or fashioning makeshift stretchers from branches and uniforms. The Navy's destroyers and small transport vessels began their nightly cycle, appear off the coast as darkness settled, load men with frantic efficiency, depart northward as the first light touched the horizon. Officers wielded their authority to maintain some semblance of order, but the desperation was palpable. Men who had fought and endured for a week of continuous battle wanted only to leave this island behind, to escape the grasp of German forces that seemed to grow stronger by the hour. There was no time for gentleness or comfort. Soldiers were shepherded onto boats, packed shoulder to shoulder on decks never designed for such cargo, and the vessels departed with engines at full power. The first nights proceeded with a kind of grim luck. The German Air Force, concentrated over the northern and central reaches of Crete, had not yet organized a coordinated interdiction of the evacuation route. Ships came and went, and men were lifted from Sfakia into temporary safety. Roughly 3,000 soldiers were evacuated on the first night alone, and Cunningham pressed the operation with renewed determination. But on the morning of the 29th of May, as dawn broke over the Aegean, German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the evacuation in progress. Within hours, Luftwaffe bombers began launching attacks on the rescue ships, attempting to return northward in daylight. The cruiser Dido came under fire, but escaped with relatively light damage. The destroyer Hereward, however, was crippled by bomb strikes and eventually sunk, though her crew was rescued by other vessels. The calculus of loss had begun, and it would only accelerate. Over the following nights, the evacuation continued with a ritual grim familiarity. As soon as darkness fell, destroyers and cruisers would depart their bases in Egypt and race northward through the Aegean. The sea passage was dangerous in itself. German U-boats and motor torpedo boats prowled the waters, and mines had been laid in several channels. But the greater danger came with daylight, when the Luftwaffe could operate with full effect. The destroyer Imperial was hit by German bombers but remained afloat. The anti-aircraft cruiser Calcutta was bombed repeatedly and sunk, her loss particularly grievous because she was one of the fleet's specialized air defense vessels. The minesweeper Abdiel struck a mine near the entrance to Sfakia and went down, taking with her supplies and ammunition meant for the garrison. Each ship lost represented not merely a loss of tonnage, but a reduction in the Navy's lifting capacity and a diminishment of morale among those still fighting on Crete. The men on the beaches could see smoke on the horizon, could hear the reports of naval gunfire, and understood that their rescuers were paying a terrible price. The pattern of operations imposed a cruel limitation on the evacuation's pace. In a typical night, perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 men could be embarked, depending on the number of ships available and the speed of loading. But the daylight hours would come, and the departing ships would face air attack, often sustaining damage that forced them to put in for repairs. Some vessels had to be withdrawn from the rotation, reducing the following night's lift capacity. The mathematics were inexorable. At such a rate, the evacuation would take many nights to complete, and with each passing night, German forces on Crete tightened their encirclement around the southern ports. The garrison commanders at Rethymno and Heraklion, cut off from direct communication with Freiburg, received no evacuation ships at all. Their men would have to either break through German lines or surrender. The knowledge that some of their comrades would not leave the island, would be captured or killed, weighed heavily on those who did manage to reach the embarkation points. By the 1st of June, Cunningham's fleet had sustained such accumulating damage that the admiral made the wrenching decision to curtail the evacuation operations. The losses in ships had reached a threshold that threatened the Navy's ability to conduct other essential operations in the Mediterranean. Cunningham issued his famous order to his ships that the Navy must stay in the eastern Mediterranean, that the army must realize that they would have to fight their way out or surrender, because the Navy could no longer sustain the daylight losses. It was a statement of fact couched in language that acknowledged both the Navy's determination and its limits. But it meant that the evacuation would cease, that those soldiers still on Crete would have no further prospect of rescue. The beaches at Sfakia went quiet as the last ships departed at dusk, their decks crowded with men who understood that they had escaped only because their comrades had not. In total, roughly 17,000 Commonwealth soldiers were evacuated from Crete during those few desperate nights. The number represented a substantial rescue, evidence that the Navy had executed its mission with courage and tactical skill despite overwhelming conditions. But it also meant that roughly 13,000 men remained on the island, some thousands killed in the fighting, others wounded and abandoned at aid stations because evacuation ships could not transport them, and many thousands who became prisoners of war in German hands. The soldiers taken prisoner faced years of captivity, deprivation, and the uncertainty of survival. Some would be moved to camps on the mainland or in other occupied territories. Others would remain in custody on Crete itself, held by occupation forces that, despite their victory, were stretched thin by the demands of controlling the island. The disproportion between those saved and those left behind was not lost on anyone. It was the nature of evacuation under fire. Some escape and others do not. The ships that survived the evacuation bore the marks of their ordeal. Hulls were scarred by shrapnel, superstructures blackened by near-miss explosions, and decks were stained with blood from wounded men packed into spaces meant for cargo. Casualties among naval personnel were significant. Sailors burned when boilers were ruptured, men torn apart by bomb fragments, officers standing on bridges when shells found them. The cruiser Orion was attacked repeatedly and suffered severe casualties among her crew, but she continued to operate and would complete her evacuation runs despite the damage. The destroyer Jervis was attacked, damaged, and required docking for repairs that would keep her out of action for months. Every ship that returned to Egypt told the same story. The Luftwaffe was merciless, the distance was long, and the losses were accumulating faster than any commander could have anticipated. Cunningham's decision to end the evacuation was an act of command discipline, but it came at an emotional cost that the admiral carried for the remainder of the war. He understood that men were being left behind, that surrender or capture awaited them, and that his order, however militarily rational, condemned them to years of imprisonment. Letters and testimonies from naval officers involved in the evacuation reveal the burden this knowledge imposed. The Navy had done what it could, had risked ships and men, had suffered losses that rippled through the fleet's morale and operational capacity. But it had not been enough to save everyone, and that inadequacy haunted commanders who had committed themselves to the principle that no soldier would be left behind. The evacuation of Crete became, for the Navy, a lesson in the limits of what surface ships could accomplish when confronted with air superiority and the determination of an enemy air force. The broader strategic implications of the evacuation extended beyond the immediate toll in ships and lives. The losses sustained by Cunningham's fleet in the Mediterranean represented a reduction in British naval power at a moment when the balance in that theatre was already precarious. German and Italian forces had inflicted significant damage on British shipping and warships, and the evacuation of Crete compounded these losses. In the weeks and months following the operation, the Navy's reduced strength in the Mediterranean would influence strategic decisions about reinforcement convoys to Malta, the tempo of operations against Axis shipping, and the allocation of vessels to other theatres of war. The rescue of 17,000 men, crucial and courageous though it was, had extracted a price in material and morale that altered the Navy's calculus for the remainder of the Mediterranean campaign. Yet in the reckoning that followed, the Navy's sacrifice was understood as necessary and justified. The men who escaped Crete lived to fight again. Many would participate in subsequent campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Europe. The 17,000 soldiers evacuated represented a repository of experience, training, and fighting spirit that Britain could not afford to lose entirely to German capture. Had the evacuation failed completely, had every soldier on Crete been taken prisoner, the morale blow to the British Empire would have been catastrophic. Instead, the partial success of the evacuation, though costly in ships and in the lives of those left behind, represented a kind of victory wrested from defeat. The Navy had contested the waters, had accepted the losses, and had brought home enough of the garrison to preserve a portion of Britain's strength. It was not a triumph, but it was a refusal to accept total defeat, and that distinction mattered in the context of 1941, when Britain stood alone against the Axis powers in a war whose outcome remained profoundly uncertain. The legacy of the evacuation resided in both the material and the moral realm. The ships sunk and damaged would have to be replaced, rebuilt, or operated without. The sailors